The Years That Shaped Me, by Sibosisonsiebender. The characters and events portrayed in this book are fictitious. Any similarity to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental and not intended by the author. No part of this book may be reproduced, or stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without express written permission of the author. Dedication. To my wife Sieno and son Abongo. Always know that life's challenges shape us, they make us to be mentally strong, and we were made to rise above them. Prologue. The Years That Shaped Me is a narrative about a young boy who is initially 5 years old at the time and lives with his grandparents, who are the only people he knows to be in his life. Life is good, there is peace and love in his world, but it all suddenly changes the moment his mother appears from nowhere and takes him away, leaving him in the care of some relatives whose hearts were cold. He is astounded to learn that he is a mother because no one has ever mentioned it to him. Not long after that, his mother vanishes into thin air after abandoning him with another relative, and she is never seen again. The 5-year-old boy matures and begins to attend school, but the grimmest storms have already begun in his tender life. The family that he has been abandoned to continuously treats him like an outsider. They forced him to plow the fields and has to work hard to earn a slice of bread. And at some point, they punish him with no food today as means of punishment. After weeks going by with no food in his stomach and being told to die, sleeping out in the coldest winters, he finally attempts to end it all by taking his own life, but he is unsuccessful. He tries to flee but keeps returning to the same place. He is constantly trapped, moving from house to house to escape his plight, but practically, everyone tries to exploit him. The only thing he is in search for is safety, acceptance, warmth, and love. Dropping out of school, being physically assaulted at home, and also being bullied at school, he feels lost. Chapter 1. The bittersweet summer evening of 1998. As I recall, it was a warm summer night in 1998 when I suddenly heard a stranger saying to me, "Tomorrow we'll go on a long trip and Mama's going to buy you some nice clothes." Mama? These words echoed in my little ears all night long. That night, I could barely sleep because of the excitement that was brought by these words. However, what was more confusing was the reality that I had never seen that strange woman during my first 6 years on Earth. As I searched the corners of my mind to see if I had ever seen her before, it became vivid to me that I was wasting my time. There were no records of her existence in my memory at all. It shocked me to death to learn that the stranger was my mother. My mind was suddenly flooded with a bunch of questions I knew so well that I wouldn't get answers for as a 6-year-old. Maybe to someone, these questions would have been seen as insignificant, but to me, they were crucial. It had been years since my mother had disappeared. The questions that kept popping into my tiny brain were, where had she been during all the time I needed her? And where was she planning to take me? I was a bit unnerved by these questions, because I had spent the first 6 years of my life with my grandparents, and a bunch of scrupulous uncles who took no nonsense from any child. The thrill of knowing that I was going to be on the bus the following day quickly overtook those thoughts. During the olden days of my grandparents, the buses were extremely affordable and always on time, and for this reason, our elders used them quite frequently, and as a 6-year-old, you would sacrifice anything to be on that bus, because it offered you an experience of a lifetime, the opportunity to get to see trees moving at an incredible speed. Trees moving? Certainly. As a child, it was exciting to see the moving trees when riding a bus or car. I had traveled by bus before, maybe once or twice if not thrice in my young age. I can't quite remember exactly how old I was though. And yet it still intrigued me to see how the trees moved in the opposite direction at such a speed. It never crossed my mind that the trees never actually moved, but it was the bus that was moving in the opposite direction, passing the stationary trees. But oh boy, I liked the experience, and if there was one thing that I understood so well and anticipated so much, was the fact that the trip with my newly found mother would offer me a chance of a lifetime. And I couldn't resist that anticipation. Nevertheless, there was one big question that still stood in the shallow corners of my mind. I still wondered where we were going. That question was still unanswered. Even though at first it still didn't seem to trouble me that much, it still bothered me subconsciously. Besides my grandparents, I grew up among my uncles. My grandparents had numerous children, they had raised both men and women, and they were all grown then. I guess they had done a great job raising so many children. My uncles were very rigid and strict, to such an extent that they didn't have time to laugh with children, and as children, we knew our place and we would not just go and play when they were around. The boys were supposed to be working in the field or far off, away from home taking care of the cattle. It didn't matter if you had just been born yesterday or just turned 6 years old. The fact that you were a boy meant that you had to be out of the house and be doing something. Child abuse, you may think. However, from how I perceive it now, that was one of the ways of teaching us a sense of responsibility so that we can grow up and become responsible adults. Not just lazy bunch of men who can't even take care of themselves in their own. I guess that is a good way of looking at it. Although my uncles were strict and uptight, they were also like my father figure. They became everything that I needed from a father as far as being responsible is concerned. Yet, that was short-lived. Everything suddenly changed the moment the strange woman, who happened to be my mother, came into my life, out of nowhere on planet Earth, and told my grandparents that she was taking me away. That was the last time I saw my loving grandparents and uncles. I was 6 years old when that happened, and going to bed that evening, I noticed something strange about my grandmother. Something unsettled her. She was not herself. I could tell from the long silence that suddenly engulfed her. It must have been the unsettling news that my newly found mother came with, the news that she was taking me away. Perhaps they didn't see eye to eye on that matter, but regardless, my grandmother must have felt compelled to agree because my mother on the other side felt entitled to do as she pleased as I was her child and she had carried me for 9 months in her womb, as she put it. And for that empty reason, my grandmother must have felt already defeated to object. She could do nothing except allow her to do as she saw fit. I also noticed that my grandmother was extremely saddened by that news. She didn't want me to leave with my mother, because she was already seeing the end of it. She already knew how the story would end, for she knew her daughter so well, more than she knew herself. It indeed made a lot of sense, because she was the one who had given birth to her and raised her. She knew my mother like the back of her hand. As a 6-year-old in that circumstance, I didn't have much of a choice. If I did, I would have chosen my grandmother over my mother. Nevertheless, a child has to do as he or she is told, and that was exactly what I also did, and besides, my grandmother didn't have the strength to fight it, so it was final. "We are leaving," my mother said. My time with my grandparents and uncles was short-lived, yet we share the best memories that will never cease to live in my heart. At the earliest age, I learned that my father died when I was still a toddler. And the fact that I had 2 other siblings, but we hardly knew each other because we were scattered in different places, living with different people. Sometimes with random people, sometimes with relatives. At least my mother was very successful in doing that, planting us all around like wild plants and leaving us under the care of those who had no care for children that weren't their own. It was as if she'd noticed when we were well taken care of by a particular family or person, she'd just show up, out of nowhere, and take us one by one. And before we knew it, we would be in different parts of the world. That was the reason why we grew up apart from each other and hardly knew each other. My father must have perhaps died when I was extremely small, because I never knew my father at all. I can't say that I had ever met him or seen him before. He never got the chance to see his 2 sons and daughters growing up. He must have died at an early age too. There is no record that he ever existed, not even a picture of him or a memory. Even if there was, it would be long buried by now. People who knew my father say he was a calm man, and some people used to say I look like him, but that never made any sense to me at all because I never knew the man. I once heard from some relatives and some random people who knew my father saying that he worked at the gold mines in Johannesburg. Perhaps it might have been the reason why I never knew him. I assume he was always away and never around like many other male figures then. Long back, men had to leave their families behind, precisely women and children, and move to distant cities in search for better job opportunities so they could take care of their families. The apartheid system required that, therefore there were many families that were without father figures. The men would come back home once in a while, or send money at home. It might have been any of the cases with my father. Sadly, he passed on too early. Sometimes life is like that. People that we need the most leave us too early before we can even take care of ourselves, and before we know it we are at the mercy of others. I hold the belief that everything happens for a reason, and one thing one should know for sure is the fact that life has its way of restoring itself to order. But then again, before that must happen, one must go through the perilous times of this life. One must go through the worst so that lessons are learned in the way that they are supposed to be learned. And as a result of that we become the best version of ourselves. I have accepted this fact and I live by it, hence I have no regret whatsoever.
My father was not there when I was growing up, but God did provide me with other means to survive. I met some amazing individuals who gave me everything I needed to move forward and grow and be where I am today. As a result of all the things that I had to face in my childhood life, I am becoming the best version of myself, hence I'm able to write this book. One would assume that it wasn't that bad because my mother was still alive at the time my father passed away, yet when my father died and was buried, that was the time my mother ceased to exist in our lives. It must have been around the year 1998 when my mother made her second disappearance. Yes, you read that right, which was the same year that she appeared as far as I can remember. The following are the details of the trip after she had snatched me away from my grandparents' house. We traveled from the outskirt of Melmoth. My grandmother's house was located in the rural part of Melmoth at the foot of the tall mountain. It used to take us several hours of walking before we could get to where the transport was found, and we had to go up the hill before we could get there. During that time, cars were increasingly scarce and no small cars could travel because there were no roads then. I remember that we hardly had any visitors as the person visiting us had to think twice because of the distance. I imagine that my mother had to carry me on her back that day because, at such a tender age, I couldn't have walked on my own. One thing that my mind couldn't have preconceived was the sad reality that I was not going to return home, and as a child, I only thought about how exciting being on the bus would be like, but little did I know that it was going to be my last time being with my grandparents and uncles. The last minutes of leaving the house were full of sadness. My grandmother said her goodbyes, and she wept. Perhaps she didn't have the strength in her to fight one more time, to try and convince my mother not to take me away. She might have thought it was not in her place to make such a decision, and off we went. Where was my mother possibly taking me, and what must have triggered her to make such a cruel decision? Only she knew. After what seemed like an hour of bus ride from the outskirts to town, the driver of the bus shouted, "Last stop." My mother tapped me on my shoulder and said, "Time to get off the bus, my boy." We immediately jumped off. Only my mother knew where we were heading. I still had no clue about our final destination. We arrived at Melmoth, which is a small town situated in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The town was established after the invasion of Zululand by the British Empire around the year 1887 and was named after Sir Melmoth Osborne. That was the town where our grandparents would travel once a month to get some groceries. As soon as we arrived, we entered another taxi. I had no idea where this taxi was going. Only my mother knew. Only she knew that my life was about to change drastically. Only she knew that I was never going back to my grandparents' house. She knew that I was never going to see them again. The trip lasted about an hour, and we finally arrived at our final destination. We met a man I had never seen before in my entire life. He was tall, light-skinned, and super lean. He was introduced to me as my uncle from my father's side. He was so thrilled to see me. He kept calling me his brother's son, and he appeared to be very friendly. After a few minutes of our meeting, there came a time when we had to part ways as the sun was about to set and it was slowly getting darker. "You will go with your uncle. He will take you home," my mother said. What shocked me even more was the fact that my mother was not coming with us. It was crystal clear that coming with us was never part of her plan. She only had come to dump me there with that man whom she introduced to me as my uncle from my father's side. It was also clear that she trusted that man. After saying our goodbyes, my mother disappeared into thin air. I never saw her again. What a turn of events. I sometimes wonder what must have happened to my mother when my father died, considering all the things that I and my siblings had to go through, living with random people, sometimes with far relatives, sometimes with people that we were not even related to at all, and who sometimes ill-treated us, called us names. The fact that I and my siblings were scattered in different places and grew up apart from each other makes me curious about what was going on in her mind. The fact that she was still alive when we went through all those hardships and was nowhere to be found. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to ask her. Chapter 2: The dramatic turn of events. My first evening at my uncle's house was the kind of evening I had not anticipated before. I was warmly welcomed by a group of 4 girls that were a bit older than I, and they also varied in age. The older one appeared to be 4 years older than the second born and to be 9 years older than the last born. They all appeared to be happy and bubbly children except for the middle one, who appeared to be a very quiet person. Her silence was too loud to be unheard or unnoticed. There was something about her subtleness, something that no words could describe. I couldn't help but also notice that she didn't seem to care much about the newly found additional member of the family. "These are your sisters. You will be staying with them from now on." My thoughts were interrupted by these words. "Hello," they all said. "Hi." I responded while looking down at the cemented dusty floors. Growing up, I was extremely shy and I was always the quiet one amongst all the other children. It wasn't long before I was introduced to the mother of the house. She was a huge woman, with big round black eyes, and she was dark in complexion. She was introduced to me as my uncle's wife. Mom Kulu was her name. Although I was very young, I could notice that Mom Kulu took no nonsense from anyone. She didn't smile much, even though she was trying her best to appear friendly. She was not that good at faking it, to such an extent that even a 6-year-old could notice that. My other swift discovery was the fact that I was the only boy child in the house, unlike at my grandparents' house where I was snatched away from. There were a lot of boys and we always fought about this and that. At least I didn't have to go through that now, I thought to myself. It also hit my mind why my uncle had felt the need to convince my mother to take me away from my grandparents. He might have desperately needed a son or a boy child, for that matter because they had some livestocks and someone needed to take care of those. But was he ready to raise his brother's son like his own son? Was he ready to love someone else's child like his own child? I remember my first evening at my uncle's house. The other children kept staring at me as though I was an alien. I guess maybe it was because they were meeting me for the first time and that they still had not.
I guess maybe it was because they were meeting me for the first time and that they still had not processed the fact that I was going to be staying with them. Perhaps they hadn't been warned or notified in advance. It was the same case with my uncle's wife. She kept staring at me nastily as if I had done something wrong. That was the beginning of my life inflicted with pain and struggles. Growing up, I had the luxury of living with different families. Sometimes these were random people that I would run to as a boy. It's quite humorous how that would happen. One of the main motivations why I would run there in the first place, I would have known one of their children. For I couldn't just budge into random people's houses and be like, "Hey, I have arrived and I have come to stay here now." There had to be some manner in which that could happen. The families I would run to didn't always see it coming. My approach was subtle. Initially, I would come as a friend of their child who is just visiting. When I was expected to leave, I would not. Strange, right? I know. Most of my life revolved around my uncle's house from my father's side. I was 6 years old when my mother brought me there and disappeared for the second time. Every day I hoped that my mother was going to come back and fetch me, but she never came. She was nowhere to be found. One day, I stopped hoping and wishing she would come back and I quit looking. It was during the first 3 months of my arrival at my uncle's house when I started to notice that people's behavior was not the same anymore. And it was slightly changing minute by minute, day by day. People were not as excited as they were in the first place. I knew that time would come, but I didn't expect it to come so sooner. The other children started calling me names, and my uncle's wife suddenly turned into a monster. The girls would always beat me up, and when I retaliated, they'd run and report to their mother and she'd call me in and yell at me without trying to find out what had actually happened. That was how the abuse started. It began to be vivid to me that I was alone. Perhaps the only person who still cared at the moment was my uncle, who was also hardly around because he was always at work. The abuse started verbally. When the other kids called me names, and sometimes they'd tell me that it was not my father's house, I was not welcome and I should go wherever I came from. And being a child, I would run and tell Mam Kalu, who happened to be their mother, but she never did anything about it. She ignored it, and she seemed to be in approval of whatever it was they said. Yes, she took sides, and she always chose her children's side. The months progressed and so was the abuse. It intensified. I was kicked and punched by my uncle's children, and when I fought back, they would run to their mother and report. She'd call me in and give me a hiding. As early as age 6, I had to learn the bitter truth. That I was alone. And that nobody was coming to save me. And the fact that people were incapable of loving children that were not their own. And the fact that people will always choose their children first in any given situation over someone else's child. From an extremely young age, I had to accept that truth and embrace it. But was I entirely right seeing things that way? Well, at age 6 that was all I saw and that was all I learned. There was nothing better to compare it with. It became clear to me that there was no way of going back to wherever I came from, even if I wanted to. I was trapped in that place. And it felt like I was on another planet and stuck with the people who hated me so much. Nevertheless, there was still hope, for my uncle still cared for me even though he was the only one that cared for me at that time. It still made a huge difference. But how was I going to tell him about all those things that were happening when he was at work? What was I going to say? And how was I going to say it? Tell him that his wife was abusing me? And how was he going to take that? I believe the man of the house knows things, knows his wife, sees everything and he hears everything. He may decide to ignore things and not address them because of fear. Sometimes you find that even when he tries to address the issue, he is not successful because the other party exerts more power. Moving from house to house, family to family, I had noticed that over and over again, and that was the case with my uncle. It wasn't long before he started noticing some things when he returned from work. The first obvious thing he noticed was that I was always alone, sitting outside, behind the house while other children were inside the house with their mother. He started asking his wife questions and in response, she would make up stories painting me as a bad child who does not listen. Even though I could not hear everything she'd say, but I could tell from my uncle's reaction in response to what was being said, he would be infuriated towards me. The abuse escalated when my uncle went to work. His wife would tell her children to sit down and not do any house chores. She would send me around the house the whole day until my uncle came back from work. In some instances, she would not give me food. While her children were given food, I was also kicked out of the house. As early as age 6, I had to learn that I needed to work to be given food. I had to work harder than any other child. She would give her children a break and tell them that I was the one who was going to do everything. At one point, I was told that I was not going to be given food until I finished plowing the field. I worked in that field the whole day while sobbing. I was called in round about the time when my uncle was about to return from work and was given a slice of bread and water, and that was my only meal for that day. My uncle had a dog whose name was Sella, which means thief. I and Sella were best friends. Sella cared for me with his whole heart. He was my only friend. He was there for me when no one else was. Especially at night when I had to sleep outside. It was during one of the coldest winter evenings. I was 6 years old. My uncle's wife kicked me out of the house. In fact, she had shown interest in beating me up, and I can't recall exactly what had happened that day and why she wanted to beat me. She always found a reason to beat me up, but that day I ran away and stayed in the bushes for the whole day. I came back home later in the evening when my uncle was about to come back from work, but unfortunately that day my uncle didn't return from work. It was only the following day that he returned. And for that whole day, I starved. When they saw me outside, they locked the doors. It was extremely cold outside, and I didn't have a jersey or a jacket. I didn't own one at all. I was wearing a torn oversized t-shirt and a small torn pair of short pants. As I sat in the darkest night behind their house, I stretched the oversized t-shirt so that it covered my knees and legs. The dog helped to keep me warm. He snoozed next to me until dawn. I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the car and the bright light. It was my uncle arriving around the early morning hours, and the time was around 3 a.m. He must have wondered what it was as he came closer. He was surprised to see that it was his 6-year-old nephew, sleeping outside in such a cold weather. "What are you doing outside?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer that question. He asked for the second time and the third time, and still, there was no answer. What was shocking was why everyone would sleep peacefully inside the house while the child was outside. When I come to think of it now, couldn't any of them feel sorry for me? Couldn't they see that I was in danger by being outside? But no, they shut the doors. They locked and made sure that I couldn't enter. My uncle must have come to his conclusions. "Get in the car," he said. I stood up and got in the car. I was extremely freezing. He threw me his jacket and his hat. It felt so warm in the car, and we went for a short drive and came back afterward. He must have reacted angrily when he got back inside the house. The obvious question he might have asked was why I slept outside. From that day, my uncle's wife and children didn't talk to me at all. It surprised me not that everybody was irate, simply because they had been questioned why I slept outside. From that day going forward, my life became worse. Verbal and physical abuse escalated, for my uncle's wife and her children turned against me completely. I was the new enemy. This is how things would transpire. As soon as my uncle would leave for work, I'd be called in right away, and my uncle's wife would start shouting at me. She would start calling me names. "Tell this dog to come here," she'd say to her youngest daughter. "Mom is calling you," she'd say. I'd quickly run inside the house, and for whatever reason, I was always sitting outside alone while others were inside with their mother. When I got to her, I was supposed to kneel like a slave, while looking down. I was not supposed to look her in the eyes. She would beat me up for that. So I would occasionally stare at the unfinished dusty floors of the kitchen, while both of my hands rested on my knees. This was a sign of showing respect. "Take the broom and sweep the floor," she'd shout. I'd quickly run, look for the broom, and start sweeping the floor. For motivation, she'd stand with a rod in her hand and beat me up while I was sweeping the floor. She'd yell at me as though my hearing was impaired. "You are not sweeping the floor properly," she yelled. And she'd beat me on my back as though she was beating an object, not a human being who could feel anything. This used to happen every time my uncle left the house for work. My uncle's house was located in a rural area. The place was 15 minutes from town. We had stand-alone rooms, which meant the kitchen was standing on its own, and the bedrooms were also on their own apart from the rest of the other rooms. This is how most of the houses used to be built in rural areas long back. Most of the time would be spent in the kitchen, which was also like a dining room, because they would cook and dine there. The kitchen was the place where most of these horrible things took place, and that was one of the places that my uncle hardly entered. His wife spent most of her time there around the fire, especially during winter time. She would smoke, but my uncle had no knowledge of her smoking habits. Only the children knew. Sometimes when she tried to discipline them, they threatened to expose that secret. Every time she would hear the footsteps of my uncle coming towards the kitchen, she quickly hid the cigarette underneath the chair. There was that time she was nearly caught. It was raining cats and dogs outside, and my uncle had come back home early that day, which was unexpected. He happened to come by the kitchen out of nowhere while she was smoking, but as soon as she heard someone was already inside, she quickly threw it inside the baggy t-shirt I was wearing, and I got burned a little. The series of verbal and physical abuse worsened every day. The other children continued bullying me as well. They would beat me up and call me names. And they would also tell me to go wherever I came from. which was something I was already used to. Even the last-born, who was younger than me, would beat me up, and when I retaliated she would run and inform her mother as always. One time I will never forget because it left me with a permanent physical scar on my right hand, and very nearly crippling it. They had given me food, and as always, I took the plate and rushed outside to eat. I always ate outside alone. My uncle's last-born followed me, and she found me sitting on the ground with the plate of food on my lap. She kicked it violently, and the food was all over the place. She must have felt good after that. I was everyone's punching bag. But that day it was not going to just end like that. I was infuriated. I kicked her so hard, she screamed like an ambulance rushing to an accident scene. She ran to her mother. I was called in as usual by her mother. I did not run away that time, even though I knew exactly what was about to happen. "Why are you making my child cry?" she asked. I didn't respond. It wasn't going to change the inevitable. It was during winter, so she was sitting around the fire. As she interrogated me, I was staring down at the dusty floor. What I had not realized that day was that she already had something to hit me with in her other hand. On usual days I'd hear a bang and clunk. But that day all I heard were drums singing in my ears, accompanied by great darkness. My mind went blank for a moment, and by the time I could realize what was happening, there was blood all over the floor, and on my right hand, there was a stream of blood. I stormed out and ran for my life. I bled for hours. The cut was so deep. I still remember that knife even today. Every time my eyes accidentally meet the scar on my right hand, I am reminded of those times. The community and the neighbors knew what was happening. They knew how I was being treated because at some point, those things happened in their very own eyes. Because we were living in a rural area, we had to fetch water from the river, and everybody in the community had to fetch water in the same place. Sometimes my uncle's wife would send me with a 25-liter container to go and fetch water from the river, and she would make me fill the big containers. So I would spend the whole day going up and down with a 25-liter on my tiny head to and fro, trying to fill the big containers while the other children were not doing anything. If the containers were not filled up, I was not given food. Many other happenings might have given the community clues that I was being maltreated. There were times when we would go fetch water with my uncle's children, and when they saw other people, they would begin calling me names, punching me, throwing me around, and dragging me down on the ground, trying to impress those people that were there. I grew up with a lot of physical scars, which also might have been a sign. Everybody picked on me, including the children that would visit my uncle's house. I grew up to be a very shy kid, who always played alone, and who also had extremely low self-esteem. I didn't have friends at all. From a very young age, I became a lone wolf. I was deliberately not given food, but at the same time I had to move around the house and do all the work that was assigned to me. That was not just easy work, but it was hard work that ranged from cleaning the yard, scrubbing the floors, plowing the fields, and doing laundry for everyone at some point. As a result of not being given food, I ended up stealing food, and they would find out and beat me up for that. All these things happened when my uncle was not around. He was at work. Looking at it now, I realized that my uncle practically lived at work and visited the house, because he spent most of his time away from his house. It was much better when he was around. People change, and there are thousands of reasons why they do. Sometimes it is not because they have changed, but it is because they have been pretending to be someone they are not, and a person cannot pretend for too long. Pretending to be someone you are not can only continue until then. After that, a person returns to his or her default self. Pretending to be nice when your default self is mean is short-lived. It is usually not long enough before a person's true character is tested. The side of the coin is also true. People get influenced and they change for better or for worse. It wasn't long before my uncle suddenly became an extremely violent man, the man I hadn't yet met. He hated me so much. Every time he was around, he would beat me up and call me names. I was the punching bag he'd run to whenever he was triggered. Ma'am Kalu finally succeeded. Every chance she got, she made up stories about me to make me look like a bad child. And it finally worked. All of a sudden, everybody in that house started hating me. My uncle had 3 goats, and those goats were my responsibility. One day he called me in. I came running as usual, and he told me to pick something up inside the kraal, and while I bent forward to pick whatever it was, he kicked me so hard and I fell over. For absolutely no reason. I ran for my life, straight into the bushes, and hid there the whole day. I could feel that I was not wanted there anymore. My uncle became more and more abusive, and I can't tell you what had gotten to him because he suddenly turned into an extremely short-tempered man, even towards everybody. That was the point in my life when I realized that I didn't have anybody on my side anymore, and it also made me hate my mother so much for bringing me there. I also realized that things were much better at my grandparents' house. It made me question why my mother had taken me away from them. Every day at my uncle's house became worse. I lived and looked forward the day when I could escape. I knew I had to remove myself from that environment.
Chapter 3. When I almost ended it all. It was in the year 1999 when I began attending primary school. For whatever reason, I didn't have the chance to attend kindergarten. The memory of my first day at school is blurry. The only thing I remember about that day is that my uncle had not gone to work so he could take me to school. We arrived at about 7 a.m. There were a lot of children and parents who had come to register their children for the first grade. After standing in the queue for what felt like many hours, the registration was over. My uncle had to leave me behind so that I could attend my first lesson on the same day. There were a lot of new faces I hadn't seen before. Other children were children I knew from the community. After a month of attending school, my situation at home became worse, and the abuse escalated. When it was time to go to school, my uncle's wife would begin sending me around the house and to the shop to buy cigarettes for her. The aim was to delay me so that I would end up not going to school or arriving there late. That was exactly what would happen. It was either I was absent or I would arrive late, and the principal would punish me. I attended the same school as my uncle's children, but they always got to school on time, and they were never in any circumstance in trouble of arriving late. They always arrived on time, even though we came from the same house. That happened frequently. As the year progressed, I started developing a strong hatred for school, and one of the obvious reasons was because of what I was going through at home. I was ill-treated to the extent, and I was not given love like all the children. There were times when I would go for days without being given food, and it was hard to even concentrate at school. Another reason was that I was always in trouble at school. The teachers always screamed at me for not wearing a proper school uniform, and also that my school uniform was dirty or not ironed. There is this one teacher that I still remember even today. She was a grade 1 teacher. She would always make me roll on the dirty floor. She always singled me out and she would call me names. When I was in grade 1, my hair was red and she would say it is because I didn't bathe. She even gave me a name from that. I hated that name with all my heart and soul. Yet other kids began calling me that name. I began to bunk school. When it was time to go to school, I would go into the bushes that were located between my school and home, and I would sleep there the whole day and wake up when the school was about to come out. My uncle's children began to be suspicious. They always looked for something to get me into trouble, and they always wondered how it was possible that I was always the first one to get home after school. The following day, it happened while I was going out from the bushes that some children from the community saw me and they reported it at school and home. I got the hiding of my life. There were many other external factors why I ended up hating school so much. One of them was the fact that I was always singled out by the teachers, and also that I was completely different from the other children. Different in a sense that I was the only one in class who didn't have school shoes and proper school uniform. I walked barefoot the entire year, and I was always wearing a dirty school uniform, and that uniform was torn. Back then, we wore grey short pants and khaki shirts, and my school short pants were badly torn. I took it to myself to solve that problem. What I did was find wires. They were different colors. I came back the following day at school wearing those short pants that were knitted with wires. I became the joke of the year. The other children laughed at me so badly, and I was even sorry that I had even come to school. At home I was not given food. My uncle's wife made sure of that. The only option I was left with to solve that problem was to steal food when no one was in the kitchen. And for some weird reason they always found out. They'd always beat me so badly. I was kicked, I was punched, and I was dragged onto the floor, just for opening the pots and grabbing something to eat. How ironic. The fact that I was not given food at home started showing, even at school. What would happen was that during break times I would go around picking up food that fell from other children. I had mastered a skill for doing that. There was a strategy that I found useful. What I'd do was to fall over nearby the piece of food I had noticed was on the ground, or I'd play around that area while no one was looking. I'd quickly pick it and put it into my mouth. As I did that regularly, people around me started noticing, and they talked about and laughed about it. It wasn't long before it got to my uncle's wife at home, and as expected, I got a beating for it. "You are embarrassing the family," she said. From picking up food, which didn't require me to bother anyone around, I then figured out another method that got me even more into trouble. I started snatching food from other learners while they were walking around and eating. I'd walk so slowly behind them and then snatch the food and run. That brought me a lot of problems, as the other children reported that to the teachers and also to their parents. As any worried parents would do, they sent letters to the teachers concerning a child stealing their children's food, and I was that child. I wasn't proud of that. There was another incident that occurred that I will never forget. It was towards the end of the year. Over the weekend, there was an accident that occurred on the road just below my uncle's house. As my uncle's house was located on the top of the hill, there was a road that cut through the hill and the cars were moving to and fro throughout the day. It happened that it rained on a Friday night, and on a Saturday morning, a bus full of people happened to pass through that road. The people on the bus were singing, and some were screaming such that we all had to stop whatever we were doing and look at the bus. The bus was struggling to go up the hill, because the road was wet and muddy, but the brave driver of the bus kept trying steadily. Just before the bus could reach the top of the hill, something caused it to reverse down the hill uncontrollably. We all had our eyes wide open. The excitement suddenly changed into a great panic as the bus fell into a huge trench that was on the side of the road. The bus managed to stop on its own. And fortunately, no one was injured on that bus. All that happened during the weekend, and on Monday, the bus was still there in the morning when we went to school. One thing I noticed that morning on my way to school, and that also got me looking forward to coming back home after school, was that there was a lot of food those people had left. And as soon as school was over, I quickly ran ahead. When I got there, the bus had already been pulled out of the ditch, but the food was still there, so I jumped in and started eating. While I was down there, the children from my school came. They started throwing stones into the ditch, and some laughed at me because I was eating the food that was in there. Really? Who would do that? I did. The news spread quickly. It got home before I could, and by the time I arrived home, I was given a hiding for embarrassing the family once again. One thing that my uncle's wife did was to make sure that she gave me hard labor around the house. I was not allowed to have leisure time, only her children were allowed to go and play with their friends. On occasional basis, she'd instruct me to fill up the big drums with water. I had to go fetch from the river 25 liters, and I used to struggle with that container on my tiny head up the hill. Sometimes I'd get home with the container half full, because the water would spill out on the way. The punishment I'd get if the containers were not filled up by the end of the day was no food for that day. If I was lucky enough to sneak out of the house during the day, I would visit the neighbors and play with their children until it was time to eat. I would stick around long enough. A similar situation happened. It had been 2 days since I hadn't been given food. It happened that while I was wandering around the house, I came across the 5 Rand coin, which was a lot of money around 1999. I remember because I was able to buy myself so many Vitgokes at school with it. I had taken it and hid it in my school's short pants. While I stood in a queue to buy at school, everybody noticed that something was unusual. Yes, I had money for that day, and that news quickly traveled to one of my uncle's daughters, who also attended the same school. By the time I got to the house, they were waiting for me. The 5-round coin I had stolen belonged to my uncle's eldest daughter. I was strangled, dragged around the house, punched, stepped on, and hit against the wall that day. I thought I was going to die that evening. After she thoroughly dealt with me, she finally let go of me. It was all ready to go outside, but I ran for my life. That was the day I decided that I was going to end it all. I decided that I was not going to suffer like that anymore. I told myself enough was enough. I had a plan, and without a doubt, I was going to execute it. I was going to end my life. But how? I thought of many ways I could do it, but the easiest one that stood out in my mind was to drink something. Come to think of it now, I see that it was foolish of me to even consider killing myself. I thought of what was available at the time. The paraffin and papers were what I was able to get hold of. And so I was able to sneak back to the house unnoticed. I knew where they kept the paraffin, so I got hold of it and a box of matchsticks. I quickly ran down to the well where they used to fetch water. Just below the well there was a small bush. That's exactly where I was going to do it. My heart pounding and a mild headache which might have been the result of crying so much. I took a sip from the bottle of paraffin, but nothing happened. I took another sip again, thinking something would happen, but still. It was becoming darker and everyone was inside the house. I had still not come back to the house, and it was never been part of my plans to come back. The plan was for them to find me cold in the morning. I took another sip of paraffin from the container. I got choked because of the awful smell, and still, I didn't die. I tried to chew and swallow the paper, hoping I would die, but I didn't. I lay down there the entire night. The paraffin didn't kill me, so I immediately woke up in the early hours of the morning and headed straight to the house. My other new problem was that I needed to have an explanation of where I was coming from and where I slept the entire night. I was frightened to just show up, so I hid behind the house. I stayed there until my uncle went to work. One of my uncle's daughters saw me behind the house, and she didn't say anything. She quickly went back to her mother and reported. I expected to be called in, but that didn't happen and I wasn't surprised. The 3 girls prepared for school and quickly left. I was the only one who was not ready. My uncle's wife was inside the house. I knew she was already aware that I was just behind the house. I had no other choice but to enter and show myself up. I needed to be at school by 7:45, and it was already getting late. I entered the house and by the time I turned around, she had already closed and locked the door behind me. She slapped and kicked me violently. And then she threw me to the wall. I screamed trying to reach for the door, but it was locked. She grabbed me and pressed me against the floor. In her hand was a wooden scrubbing brush, and she hit me with it while her heavy body was pressing me down onto the floor. I was just a tiny 7-year-old. There were times I couldn't breathe. The smacking and the punching carried on for about 40 minutes, and when she finally released me, I ran towards the door. I was extremely late for school. My head, my arms, and my face had bumps on them. When I got to school, the children made fun of me. The teachers never bothered to even ask what had happened or why I looked like I was attacked by the mob. The other children laughed the whole day. Some even made up a story that I was like that because I had gone to the farms to steal, and I was caught and beaten up. I was a kid that everybody would pick on, and no one dared to stand up for me, not even my so-called family. The final school term ended. The parents were the ones who were called to fetch our report cards. My uncle was the one who went and collected mine. On my mind I thought I had failed and had already convinced myself. But to my surprise, I had passed, and my uncle came back with the task that we had completed in class, which contributed to our final mark. It was a poster that was beautifully colored in. It had my name written on it. They said I am the one who did that work, but I couldn't recall myself doing that. In my eyes, that was too good to be mine. As a kid, I grew up being told how stupid and useless I was. To some extent I believed it. Sometimes they would even call me a dog. Looking at it now, I don't see anything so negative about dogs, and I don't view them as stupid. I have no idea what was that about. But coming from a black community then, the worst thing someone could call was a dog. I know better now. Dogs are smart. They're kind, caring and protective. Chapter 4. From house to house. The year 2000 is the year that I vividly remember in my mind. It was a year full of hopes. I had always hoped that my mother would come and take me back to my grandmother's house, but there was still no sign of my mother. I heard that she was still alive and that some people were seeing her in town quite frequently. The town was about 15 minutes from my uncle's house. I found it quite interesting that she still never made any effort to come to visit me. There were terrible things that were said to me about my mother, things that shouldn't have been said to an 8-year-old. My uncle's wife would usually say those things after she had been beating me up. She didn't need to have a reason to beat me up. "Your mother is chasing men in town," she'd say. I was 8 years old when she used to say that, and at some point, she'd tell me to go and cry on my father's grave, which I did once. I thought my father could hear me. Somebody had shown me where my father was buried, so I'd go there sometimes when they beat me up. I'd cry until no tears were coming out. My life became harder and harder every day. At one point, our neighbor came to report that his house was broken into and a lot of items were stolen, including food. My uncle's wife told that man that I was the one who broke into his house and stole those things. The man became very angry. He beat me up so badly, although I kept telling him that it wasn't me, he didn't listen. After he let go of me, I ran away. That day I spent the whole day in the bushes. I came back home in the evening only to sit behind the house. When everyone was going to sleep, I sneaked into the kitchen and hid inside the huge empty water container. I hid there until the morning. When school reopened, I couldn't go back to school. That was the year that I ran away from my uncle's house. It was when the schools had just reopened for the year. I was supposed to begin the first term for 2nd grade. While staying at my uncle's house, I discovered another family that was on the side of our house. That family was approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes from my uncle's house. And for an 8-year-old, to travel that distance was no child's play. It must have taken me a long time to get there, but I eventually did. Luckily, those people had seen me before, as some of them has been to my uncle's house. They were their church friends, and because of that, I wasn't much of a stranger. I came as a visitor, but I managed to stay there until the evening, and when I was supposed to leave, I didn't leave. There was a boy in that family whom I knew from school. His name was Zola. We were around about the same age, and we immediately became friends, and that became my new ticket to staying there. The following day, I was expected to go back to wherever I came from, but I didn't. I explained to Zola what I was going through and that I ran away from home and the obvious fact that I wasn't intending to go back to my uncle's house. Zola made a plan for the night. He told me to hide behind the house until everyone went to sleep. At Zola's house, they had standalone rooms, so the plan was that Zola was going to call me in as soon as his parents went to bed, which worked for the first night. During the day, I had to wander around the area until everybody came back from school. And because I was staying at Zola's house without his parents knowing, I was forced to wander around the area and return to Zola's house when it was time to sleep. Zola's parents eventually found out that I had been staying there. I think it must have been Zola's sister who reported that. Zola had 3 sisters. The 3 of them attended the same school. They are the ones who found out first that I was staying at their house and quickly reported Zola to their parents. I guess Zola might have explained the whole situation to them because I ended up staying there. Things were very different compared to my uncle's house. There I was given food, and I was not beaten up unnecessarily. There was one thing though that I had to do. I had to work hard to stay there. Their house was located at the top of the hill, and there was a river that ran through, separating the 2 areas. I remember that we had to fetch water from the river with the 20-liter containers and climb the hill again with them on our heads, but at least I didn't have to do that alone. All of us had to go fetch water at the same time. I had to learn how to cook because we took turns doing chores. It was very different from my uncle's house. At Zola's house, they had their own set of rules to maintain order. We were not allowed to go anywhere, and we had to have a proper reason for leaving the house. We also couldn't go play with other children. I guess that was one of the ways of maintaining order and establishing authority, but I do remember that as long as everyone did what they were supposed to do, everything was okay. It happened that on the day I ran away from my uncle's house, his dog also followed me but ended up going somewhere. It didn't get to Zola's house, and at age 8 I wouldn't have realized that the dog followed me. It never occurred to me that Zola followed me. It was also clear that at my uncle's house, they also had been looking for me all that time. My uncle must have eventually found out about my whereabouts, probably from the people who had seen me and who might have heard that a kid was staying at Zola's house. It was one of those unexpected evenings. We all went to bed after the evening dinner. Everything was okay, and I wouldn't have suspected anything. I had even stopped being so afraid that one day my uncle would just show up. I had accepted the fact that I was staying there and no one would ever bother me. It was in the middle of the night when we heard a loud bang, accompanied by "Open up. I know he's here." "Who are you?" Zola asked. "Open up," my uncle said forcefully. "I only need him and my dog," he said while attempting to push the door. I had already recognized the voice right away. My heart was pounding, I was shaking, and it was as if I had seen death itself. The door was opened, and he dragged me outside and tied both of my hands with a belt. He kicked me violently, and I fell. "Why did you steal my dog?" he shouted. He kicked me again and dragged me onto the ground. We still had a long way to go, and he had Stjambok. He flogged me. I wailed in the middle of the night, and everybody in the area must have heard me calling the dog's name, but still the dog was nowhere to be found. From Zola's house to our house, it was a long way. He flogged me with Stjambok all the way. I was in so much pain, my body was so torn because of the flogging, and I couldn't even sit, sleep, or walk. The dog came back the following day after I returned. I couldn't tell if it had been there the entire time or if it was missing, as my uncle had claimed. I was in prison again, and the physical abuse continued. It became more intense than ever before because I was made aware that in that house nobody cared about me. Even my uncle, who used to care, had become my worst enemy. I cried day and night. Everybody had turned against me. It was towards the end of the year 2000. The schools were about to close, and I hadn't set a foot in school that year. I wasted a lot of time running around, jumping from house to house. It wasn't long before another chance to escape presented itself, and I took it with both hands. Chapter 5. An encounter with a boy named Sipho. Let me tell you of this one interesting family I came across toward the end of the year 2001. How I ended up with this family is quite intriguing. Esho is a small town surrounded by farms. There were compounds in which people lived in back then, and even now, I believe this is still the case. I came across a boy named Sipho, whose parents were working at the sugarcane farms. He used to visit my uncle's house. I suppose his mother was a friend of my uncle's wife, or it was the other way round. I can't tell you exactly if it was his father or mother who were friends. Sipho was way older than I, but we got along just fine. I also noticed that my uncle's wife was very friendly toward other children, especially the boys that would visit the house, but toward me she was so cold. However, it was much better when there were visitors. At least she would try to pretend to like me, and because of that, I always prayed that Sipho would visit every day. One thing that Sipho quickly picked up was the fact that my uncle's children used to beat me up, even when he was there. Sometimes he would tell them to stop doing what they were doing, and at that point in time he was the only one that stood up for me. I felt safe when he was around. I used to be sad when he didn't show up the whole week. To give me a break, sometimes he would take me to the farms where he and his parents were staying. Sometimes I stayed there for weeks. I used to follow him wherever he went. At some point I would just show up at his place only to find out he wasn't there, and I'd sit outside his house the whole day. Although Sipho used to stand up for me, it wasn't long enough before I realized that he also had his own share of problems. His father was an extremely violent man. At one point, he butchered Sipho's mother while he was drunk. We had to run away at midnight and spent the night in the sugarcane fields. There were several other times we had to all run from Sipho's house, because every time his father was drunk, he would beat his mother up. There was a time that Sipho's father almost beat me up and Sipho was not there. Luckily, I managed to escape. I don't really remember where I ran to that night. But it wasn't long before I realized that it was time to leave, but there was no way I was going back to my uncle's house. My only option was to go back to Zola's house. They were so happy to see me. It was as if they expected me. They also told me how sad they were because of how I had left the previous time. It was 2 months before the year ended when I came back to Zola's house. I was welcomed by his parents with open hands. Zola's parents were generally nice people, yet they were strict, but that was just part of being parents. They needed to make sure that we were in line. Although I had to work hard to stay there, to me that was nothing compared to the places I had been. They had their own set of rules, but at least I could have food. To stay there meant that I had to work harder than everyone. I learned how to cook and clean. I had to prove myself. They liked staying with me, but I think part of it was because I was playing my part and never complained. Even when other children complained about doing the house chores, there were times where I felt like other children slacked, and I had to do more work. I still never complained because I'd seen worse, and that was nothing compared to where I was coming from. The year 2001 ended. It was going to be a month before the schools reopened for 2002, and it meant that I was going to be turning 10 years old and in the second grade. I had spent the whole 2 years jumping from house to house. It was in 2002 that I returned to school to begin grade 2. I was still the only kid that didn't have the school uniform. I used to wear a yellow shirt and a yellow t-shirt that looked like a soccer jersey. I wore that every day I went to school. Throughout that whole year I didn't have school shoes. I was walking barefooted, season in and season out. The family that I was staying with couldn't afford to buy shoes for 4 children. I remember one of the coldest winters of 2002. Before we could get to school I had to walk down the hill, and by the time I got to the river my foot would be excruciating, and at one point my feet became numb. The cold water down the river felt so warm. That was the river that I had to cross before I could get to school. Other children used to look at me like I was insane, but I was sane. I was just a different kind coming from a different background. When I returned to school in 2002 to begin my second grade, something was different. Something had changed within me. A new love for school was reborn, and what reinforced it was the fact that being at school was the only place that I could be free mentally. It was also the only place that I could relax. When that last bell went off, sending us home meant that I had to rush through the school's gate and rush back to Zola's house. Part of me was still afraid that my uncle would just show up and take me home, and I didn't want that to happen, so every time the bell went on, I quickly ran in the opposite direction. Even when the school was closed, I longed for it to be opened. It was my mind that had been renewed and I was a new person. It also dawned on me that in class, I was the oldest kid and that all my peers were far ahead. I remember that I had wasted 2 years out of school. The situation was not always okay at Zola's house. Sometimes it was made clear that I didn't belong there, and I also understood that fact, and hence I didn't demand things. I remember that I used to love my school books in spite of the fact that they were not covered, but the books of the other 3 children were covered. At school, they had told us to cover our books, so what I did was to go to the neighbor's house and asked for old books that were covered, and I stripped those covers off and covered my books. The same evening, the house that we were sleeping in caught fire. My school books were inside that room. My heart was shattered into pieces. The short pant and t-shirt that I was wearing to school were also inside that room. Luckily the neighbors gave us some clothes. It was also reported to the school that our house had caught fire. The school was kind enough to give us new books, and they also allowed me to wear whatever I could wear. One thing I came to realize was the fact that even though I had joined Zola's family, it was clear that I was not a biological child. That was seen in the way that I was treated. Although I was allowed to stay there were times where I was expected to do everything around the house, like cooking, cleaning, laundry and fetching water from the river. All those things I did without complaining because I understood that they were doing me a favor to even let me stay with them in the first place. They didn't have to take me in. I wasn't their responsibility, but they did take me and I appreciated that. Yes, there were times when everything was too much to handle, especially when I had to do everything while other children around the house were not bothered at all and were busy playing outside. As a 10-year-old I also wanted to go and play. I understood my circumstance. I had to earn my stay there every day. I had to accomplish whatever tasks that were assigned to me. That became my new motivation to love school even more, because it was only during school days that I would rest a bit. I remember I used to be sad when schools were closed because it meant that I would spend the whole day at home doing the house chores. One thing I also learned at the age of 10 was to focus on what was important, and to also be understanding of the fact that parents that aren't your own will not love you the same way that they love their children, and will not treat you the same, and the fact they will always choose their children over you. That was expected, and that was okay. It was just a matter of preference. But later, having met some of the Christian families who have helped me with a lot of things, has made me realize that it is indeed possible to be loved completely. The more I embraced that fact, the more my life became very easier. It was easier for me to get by, to focus on what was crucial, and silence the noise. I remember there were so many times Zola's sister would tell me that it was their own home, I should go back to wherever I came from, but that wasn't the first time I was hearing that. I also heard those thousands of times while I was still staying at my uncle's house, and to tell you the truth, those were usually accompanied by the beating and the smacking. I stayed with Zola's family for 1 year, and because of the changing situations there, I ended up escaping. But this time around, it was just after the schools had closed for the final term. It was overwhelming to stay there. I had to work like a slave, and I couldn't get a chance to even go play outside, while other children were able to. Every time if there was something that wasn't done around the house, I always got blamed for it. There were times when I would escape and visit my friend, but when I came back, I would get a hiding. It had been a year since I had left my uncle's house. I didn't know what to do other than go back there again, so finally I left Zola's house. I went to school and never returned. I just disappeared. I was 9, turning 10 years old the following year and going to my 3rd grade.
Chapter 6. The Dangerous Night. It was around December 2002 when I finally heard the news that they saw my mother in town. The people who had seen her also confirmed that they had been seeing her regularly. She was selling clothes for some man. If someone had seen her regularly, it meant that she was staying around town, I thought. I disappeared and left my uncle's house. I guess they were used to that by then, and apparently, they didn't even bother to look for me. It might have taken me 2 hours to get to town on foot. I could track down my mother and find her. However, before I could, I had to go around asking the people who were also selling clothes. I explained who I was, where I was coming from, and whose child I was until another woman who was also selling clothes told me to wait at a certain shipping container that had been converted into a shop. I waited there for a while. The woman who had asked me to wait there came back with another woman, who must have been my mother. It had been a long time since I had not seen her, and I had to guess if it was her, and I was right. I could not figure out how long she had been around town, and I do not even remember if that mattered to me at all. As the two women approached, the other one had a big smile on her face. "I have found your mother," the other woman said. I remained quiet. Turning to my mother, she continued, "Is he the older one?" "No, there are 3 of them. The other 2 are not here," she responded. I was shocked to find out that she remembers she had children, but I was excited to meet my mother at last. She was also happy to see me, I guess. If my mother had been around the same town I was in, why she had never come to visit us? This still made no sense to me. I told my mother that I would not return to my uncle's house, and I also told her about all the things that had happened while I was staying there. The day ended, and she had to return the remaining clothes and the money that she had worked for that day to her boss. Her boss was a short man, dark in complexion, and he appeared to be in his mid-40s. My mother introduced me to him, and he greeted me with a smile, and jokingly said, "It is good that you are around now. You can work with your mother to sell for me." I was 9 years old, and I started going around town selling watches, face clothes, hats, and padlocks. There were areas I would not go to though because I knew very well that there were increased chances of meeting the people that I knew, who might go tell my uncle about my whereabouts. Even when I moved around, I was always cautious. It was not a long time before I learned a few things about my mother, about the places that she would go to and her lifestyle. Yes, my mother was an alcoholic. I learned that a few weeks after I found her, she'd indulge in alcohol, drink the little money that she had earned made from selling clothes. And sometimes she used to come to her place drunk almost every day. Sometimes she would go with me to her favorite drinking place and would drink alcohol and get drunk. I had no choice but to wait there for her while she was drinking. That was her daily life. As a minor, there was nothing I could do about it. That very fact right there could have been part of the reason she abandoned us and the reason she never visited us at all, or just check up on us. She rented a room that was located approximately a few minutes from town. It was a walkable distance, and we would walk to town with her every single day to sell clothes for her boss. One day something happened that almost cost my life. I and my mother had come from town to sell clothes, as usual, and my mother decided she would make a stop at her usual shebeen to buy some traditional beer. She always took me along with her. I didn't want to be around those people because I was the only child there. And there were several times I was upset, but I didn't have much of a choice. I had to be there. All I had to do was to wait for her, even though I hated being there with all my heart.
Several times I felt like I was a burden to my mother, because she couldn't freely continue with her usual behavioral patterns in my presence as she used to. It felt like every time a child had to follow her, and that child was me. If I had any other choice or anywhere to stay and wait for her while she was gone swimming in alcohol, I would have grabbed that opportunity with both hands. One day my mother came to our place with two men whom she introduced as my uncles. But what was surprising was that I had never seen those men before,
and she also did not explain how we were related to those so-called uncles. If you were to ask me, I'd tell you without a doubt that those men appeared to be very suspicious and dangerous. I also noticed that my mother was extremely drunk that day, but those two men were sober. For whatever reason, my mother told me I was going to leave with those two men when they leave. I overheard those strange men discussing how they would take me to the dance. My mother had too much to drink to notice or hear that and the implication of it. I realized that if I would not do something about going with those men, something terrible was going to happen to me. It was either I was going to be reported missing or found dead somewhere. Dark as it was outside, I got out of the room as if I was going to return in a few seconds. I ran and left the three of them inside the room. Just behind the room, my mother was renting. There was an old lady who lived there. She had been living there for some time and she knew my mother. I ran to her house and knocked, and fortunately she was around. I told her what was happening and that my mother had too much to drink, and that she had agreed that those two strange men should go with me. It must have been after 9 p.m. when that happened, and it was extremely dark outside as it was during winter. Fortunately, the old lady understood what was happening or about to happen, and she allowed me to stay for the night. The way my mother had too much to drink that day, she did not know what had nearly happened. Even the old lady confirmed that she hadn't seen those two men before. That's how I escaped that horrible night. The following day, the old lady spoke some sense to my mother. She candidly told her that the environment wasn't conducive for the child and she needed to do something about that, and fortunately, she listened. That's exactly what led me to part ways with my mother for the third time at age 9. "I will take you to where your brother is," my mother said. I didn't know whether to be excited or sad, but one thing I knew for sure was the implication of that statement. It meant that I was about to part ways with my mother again. But for how long? For how long were we going to keep playing that game? I wish I could have asked these questions, but I couldn't. I was still too young to even reason like that. Part of me was excited that I was going to see my brother finally. The other part was just numb. Too numb and dead inside. That week went by so fast, like someone was chasing it, and before I knew it, bags were packed and it was time to go. It's interesting how my mother would always not show up when she was making those decisions. I remember the morning we had to leave. My mother dropped me by the taxi rank. She asked the driver where to drop me, and she then disappeared. My brother must have last seen me when I was extremely small. How we ended up living in different towns wasn't clear, but the person who knew that very well was my mother. The driver was told where to drop me off, and he seemed to have known the house where I was supposed to be dropped off. I might have fallen asleep the moment the taxi left the station because all I heard was, "Time to get off, boy," the driver shouted. I hesitated. Being unaware that the message was directed to me, I carried on sitting until he motioned with his hand pointing in my direction. I slowly moved to the door, trying by all means not to step on people's groceries. When I was just halfway through, the driver's assistant easily picked me up and tossed me on the ground. He then showed me the house where my brother lived. They recognized me at the distance that I and Zola were siblings. They said we looked alike. I explained who I was and how I had arrived, and they asked where my mother was. I told them that my mother didn't come, but she left me at the taxi station and explained to the driver where I was going. It also shocked them that my mother did not come. It seemed like they longed to see her. It wasn't long before my brother finally arrived around about 1700 hours. They introduced him to me, and we reunited. My brother was so surprised that I had grown so much. The last time we saw each other was when I was still peeing myself and being fed. I once heard that my father had a house in the same area when we were growing up, but after he had died, my mother abandoned the house. The walls fell and people took what they could and divided his property. In the end, we inherited the wind. That was the end of it all. The good neighbors took my brother in and stayed with him, and that was the same house I had arrived at. It was not that long before they introduced me to Aunt Themby. Aunt Themby knew my father. They grew up together, and she also knew me from a very young age. She also knew my mother even though they weren't close. Aunt Themby did not have a child, so they agreed I would live with her, and so that was how I ended up staying with Aunt Themby.
Chapter 7. On the move again. The Christmas of 2002 came and passed so quickly. Before I knew it, it was about time schools had to reopen. I was ready for the 3rd grade. On the day before the school reopened, Aunt Themby took me to school for registration, and it took us an hour to get to my possibly new school. The atmosphere was dull for my liking. The walls were painted brown and cream white. The ground was bare. You could see brown soil. Just outside the tired school gate were 2 crooked trees planted on either side, and under one of them was an old lady selling snacks. It was her usual spot. Within a few minutes, the registration was over. Welcome to my new school, everyone. The first 2 to 3 months of staying with Aunt Themby were great. I felt loved and cared for, and the only thing I had to do was simply go to school. Although she'd never been to school, she knew the importance of education. I could tell that she wanted what was best for me. There was one thing about her, though: she was very strict. She kept me inside all the time, and she wouldn't allow me to go play with the other children. The only chance I'd get to play with the other children was when I was at school. Even though Aunt Themby was strict, she always went all out for me. I remember the fact that she was unemployed. We lived on her pension, and she also had fields she was working in, and they provided us with food. Another reason I will always remember Aunt Themby is what she did for me. When I arrived to live with her, my age was unknown. Yes, the government knew nothing about me. I didn't exist. It's like I was there but not there. I didn't know how old I was, and so she was the one who helped me find out how old I was. It is not that I lost my birth certificate. I didn't have one at all. How she found out my age still intrigues me, even today. She remembered that the day I was born was the same day that one of our relatives had died. Strange, right? So what she did was to go to the grave of that person to find out the date that was written on the tomb, and that's how she could figure out my age. That is one of the many reasons I will always remember her in my life, because having met her helped me to recover my identity. It is staggering how uninvolved my mother might have been all those years, and the fact that all those years I still didn't even have a birth certificate. Perhaps one reason that could have led to that was the fact that we were moving around quite a lot. We changed families from time to time. It could have been one way I lost my birth certificate. That is, if it ever existed. To tell you the truth, there were times I doubted if I was born in the year that Aunt Themby said I was born in. In fact, the only person who knew that for sure was my mother. My first day at my new school was not bad at all, even though I was still struggling here and there. One of the many problems I had as a kid was low self-esteem. What led to that was probably because of how I was treated in the past 3 years, and the year 1998 had been severe. It was my first time experiencing physical abuse. Although the situation was a lot better in 2003, I still wore torn school shirts at school. I was still different from other children, but at least I was given love and I was provided for, unlike where I had been before. It wasn't long before we started experiencing problems. It was like waking up one day and finding Aunt Themby to be a complete stranger. She became extremely short-tempered and aggressive. I remember the day I had to sleep in an unfinished standalone room because she had locked her room and left. She did not have her own house, but what she lived in was a back room. We had other people. The owners of the main house were living in the same yard. He owned most of the big property. Aunt Themby once told me that the main property was owned by his brother, who lived with his wife and children, but they never seemed to get along at all. One thing I noticed was that she wasn't so fond of his brother's wife. As a kid, I didn't know the difference nor the implications of that, however. I remember how she would beat me up. Because I had visited those people, it made no sense to me because they were such good people. I remember how they used to feel sorry for me sometimes. There were several times when she chased me out of the house and they'd take me in for the night. They had a TV and, seeing a TV nearly for the first time in my life, kept me visiting that house. Sometimes I'd return from school to find that Aunt Thimby was not at the house, and so I'd stay at his brother's house. She used to be angry for the entire week, because I had done it, and as an 11-year-old, you can imagine how tough it must have been when someone you relied on for food was angry at you. It used to be hard even for me. Aunt Thimby had anger issues. Sometimes she would just explode, and she also spent most of her time at one of the tuck shops where they sold traditional beer. Sometimes she would come home drunk, and she would yell at me for no reason. There were also some times when I had to run and sleep where my brother was staying. We were halfway through the year when those problems started. She might have gotten tired of staying with me. Or maybe it could have been the fact that she could not keep having to feed both of us. I remember that as young as I was, she wasn't receiving any financial help from my mother. It was like my mother came and dumped me to her and she disappeared. Not to sound disrespectful or what, but I will say this either way. It was irresponsible of my mother to just leave us like that, and it still wouldn't make any sense to me why she never took care of her children or made no effort but pushed her responsibilities to other people. I remember how Aunt Thimby had to go work on the field so she could feed me, as old and frail as she was, yet my mother was still out there living her own life and feeding her desires. Towards the end of the year 2003, I think it might have been around August if not September, Aunt Thimby planned with the owner of the tuck shop, where she used to indulge in traditional beer. The man owned about 7 or several cows. The arrangement was that I was going to take care of those cows for an agreed amount of money. They discussed the payment, and I wasn't involved in those discussions, because they considered me a minor. I was only told about the instruction that I was going to be taking care of those cows. I did not have much of a choice. I was not being asked whether I could or wanted to. I was being instructed. It meant that when I came back from school, I'd have to go to the house, change and walk for about 30 minutes to Shelley's house, or where the cows would be tied, and take them to the field so they could graze. That happened for a few months, but I never saw the money. The person who was receiving the money was Aunt Thimby. That money didn't even buy me any clothing, not even my school uniform. At school, I still wore torn shirts, and the other children still ridiculed me for not wearing school shoes, and for not even carrying a school bag. I carried my books with plastics, while the rest of the children in my school owned bags. Not that I'm comparing myself with them. I knew well that our situations were possibly never the same, but Shelley was paying enough to afford at least a school bag or school shoes. But either way, that wasn't much of a problem to me, and according to me, that situation was far better compared to where I was coming from. Where I was coming from was always my frame of reference. That helped me to cope. One thing I had to learn quickly as a child was the fact that those people I had to stay with, who were not my biological parents, never owed me their love. They didn't have to treat me like they treat their children. I understood they were not my parents, and I was not their responsibility, and that if I had to stay with them, then I had to work harder than their children to create the need for me to be there. Grasping that fact as early as possible helped me to be strong, to be tough-minded, and to keep moving. It brought me comfort in times of pain. It is the reason I could survive those tough times. As the year progressed, Aunt Thimby became harsher at home, and the only place that became my new refuge was being at school. At least I could be free when I was at school, and the boys who had been bullying me since the beginning of the year got tired of it. The way things were so tough on me, I remember that at one point I had to lie. Schools were closed, but I woke up that morning, took a bath, ate breakfast, and dressed up for school, and off I went. You'd laugh if I tell you I spent the whole day in the bushes because schools were closed. At least there was peace there. Sometimes I'd take care of Charlie's cows for the whole month, and when it was time for payment, there'd be no payment. What would happen was that Aunt Thimby would go to Charlie's tuck shop and order traditional beer on credit, and Charlie would deduct from my payment. It was a hot morning in November 2003. Schools were closing, and we were going to receive our year-end school reports. It had been a tough year at home, but I pulled it through at school. I knew I had passed, and I had put in a lot of hard work at school and made sure that I missed no school days. I remember the night before the schools were closing. I hadn't slept. My heart was pounding. I had been entertaining the thoughts of escaping Aunt Thimby's house so many times. but would immediately reject those thoughts because of fear. However, what was different that night was the fact that the thoughts of escaping stayed with me till dawn. That was when I knew I was going to do it, no matter what. One powerful and mysterious thing about our thoughts and plans is the fact that we own them. They are ours alone, and no other human being can perceive them unless we decide to tell them. It is intriguing how that night came and passed and how my mind was so busy orchestrating my escape plan with no one knowing. So many times I had dismissed the thoughts of leaving because I was worried about too many things, but that evening I was so sure. I was so ready to leave and never come back again. The problem then was to leave with no one noticing. I had to think about that and come out with a plan. I woke up that day and dressed up in my school uniform and left early in the morning. I think Aunt Thimby must have gone to the fields. I did not have a lot of clothes, but I could put some I had in a plastic bag, therefore there weren't any red flags. I had to start at school that day, and we would not be there for a full day since it was the last day of the year. Before I knew it, the bell rang. Our teachers quickly handed us our report cards. And because there were a lot of children coming from my community, I had to wait a bit for them to go. They'd have wondered why I was taking a different direction, so I waited for everyone to leave. The only place I could think of was my uncle's house. I had thought things would be way better that time, for whatever reason. It took me straight 3 hours to arrive in Esho. I had to walk for another hour from town to my uncle's house. I wondered what was happening to Aunt Thimby's mind. Did she wonder where I was? Did she hope I was coming back? I heard a few months later that a woman was looking for me all over the town. From the description they gave me, I figured it might have been her. I knew that telling her that day I was planning to leave would have been a bad idea. It was going to make it impossible for me to leave that place, so I made sure that nobody knew, not even my brother. I was back to square one, at my uncle's house, except that a lot had changed. My uncle's wife and children had left the house. My uncle was then staying alone. His wife and children had moved somewhere else, and I believed it was not a planned or civil move. There had been too many conflicts, conflict after conflict, which led to the entire family splitting up. Mamkula finally packed her bags and left the war zone. Returning to the same place meant that I was going to be spending the day alone. My uncle was seeing someone else then. I suppose that was the reason Mamkula decided to take her children and leave the house. The first few months of staying at my uncle's house were alright. A lot had happened and things were never the same. My uncle spent little time at home. During the day he'd be at work. Sometimes he came back home after work. There were times he didn't, and those days I had to spend the night alone at the house. He had goats I had to take care of. I guess that's possibly the only thing that kept us at peace, because he needed someone to take care of them. Although there was peace for a while, I could sense that there was still deep mistrust between us. My uncle was quite an unpredictable character, and anything could have happened. It was much worse that time around because I knew he had a gun. Another thing I noticed was the fact that my uncle feared his wife and children. He feared they could do him harm, so he always watched his back. Every time he'd come back from work, he'd survey the whole yard and he would mark each footstep that he saw on the ground and would question who had been to the house. He did that almost every day. While I was at school, something happened and that was the very thing that led me to run away and never come back to that house ever again. It was around the 10th month of 2004. It has been a normal morning. I woke up that morning and got ready for school. As usual, the day was over and the school came out and I headed straight home. Every day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd go for soccer practice after I had taken the goats out in the fields. That was my daily routine. Even on that day, I did exactly that. It was around 17:30 when my uncle got off the bus from work and, as usual, he was walking fast, smoking his cigarette. His eyes were on the ground, studying the footsteps. The soccer pitch that we played on was just above my uncle's house and the way from the bus stop to my uncle's house passed by the pitch. It wasn't long before my uncle returned from the house. I was in the middle of the soccer practice match when he came and stood there and signaled with his hand that he was calling me. I quickly rushed to hear what he wanted to say. "You're always away from home," he shouted. I responded but kept staring at the ground. After a while, I followed him to the house with no further exchange of words. Silence fell upon both of us. "Call Mamkan and I want you to be back here as soon as possible," he yelled. I ran like a mad dog being stung by the bees in a very hot day. It was already dark outside. The house I was going to was on the other side of the river. I had to pass through the bushes to get there. There was an area I was most afraid of. It was a gulf covered by bushes. People used to fetch water there. At night we knew the place had ghosts, and when I was 12 years old, ghosts were real and I was afraid of them. One thing I was never told was the reason I had to call Mamcan in such a hurry. I never would have thought there was anything wrong. I only found out later, but then it was too late. I ran to her house, and luckily she was at home. "My uncle has sent me to call you," I said. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Yes, I responded. She quickly took her coat, and we rushed to my uncle. On the way, both of us were quiet, and we had to walk as fast as we could, as it was already dark. Just before we reached the house, we met my uncle on the way. As we got closer, my uncle pulled out 9-rod and a spear trying to hit me with it, but luckily Mamankan pushed me down and my uncle missed. She quickly stood between us. I ran straight into the bushes and never looked back. It was so dark that I could not even see where I was going. I had to find a place to spend the night, and the only place that came to my mind was one of the people that I knew. We were related a bit, but I could not explain exactly how we were related. All I knew was that the grandmothers were sisters, and even that I could not explain. What mattered was they understood how we were related, and to them, it meant everything. That was the only place I could run to, and I did. In my mind, there was a lot of confusion and questions. I wondered why was my uncle so angry, and why did he want to kill me? What had I done wrong? It was until the following day that I got to find out the real story of what had happened. While I was at school during the day, some people came by my uncle's house, and they took everything that he had. They only left him with what he wore that day. Unfortunately, I had to be the scapegoat. All the anger that my uncle had was directed to. I had to bear all that even though I had nothing to do with it. Seemingly the people who did it knew exactly what they were doing. That was the day that my uncle last saw me. Every time he was in sight, I would run away. Wherever I went, I'd always watch out for him. That happened until the day he died and was buried. Chapter 8. The tragic but not so tragic news. Towards the end of the year, 2004, circumstances introduced me to Mr. and Mrs. Petersons. I wondered how it must have felt like that one night when they heard a knock on their doors, wondering who it might have been, knocking on the doors so late at night. Mr. Petersons opened the door for me with a stick in his hands, and when he opened, there stood a 12-year-old in the dark shadows of the night. Mr. Petersons was a very old man with a grey head. He was in his late 80s, his eyesight was beginning to be poor, and I don't think he knew me back then, although we might have met coincidentally several times. Mrs. Petersons was the one that knew me. "Who are you?" he asked. "It is me," I responded with a shivering voice. He opened the door and signaled with his hand for me to come in. I entered. There were dry tears in my eyes. One could see that I had been crying, and because I was wearing short pants, I had scars on my legs caused by the bush I ran into. Mrs. Petersons recognized me as she had seen me before. She knew my uncle, and she also knew my father. "This is Gwen's son," she said. "What is happening?" she asked. I explained from beginning to end what had happened and why I was running away. They understood, yet they still had so many unanswered questions. They allowed me to spend a night. Even on the following day, I also spent a night there. The third day came and the fourth and the fifth day. That was how I ended up with the Petersons family. There were many people staying there. Mrs. Petersons had plenty of children, both daughters and sons, and some were already married. They welcomed me with warm hands. It was with that family that I could successfully finish grade 4. When the year ended and the school closed, we fetched our reports, and I had passed, and before I knew it was 2005, and I was ready for my 5th grade. The year 2005 was the year that rekindled my hope. Finally, I was with the people that cared for me. Mrs. Petersons and Mr. Petersons became my new guardians. They took me in, cared for me, and they treated me like their own child. I experienced no hate or anger from them, and when I made a mistake that any other children made, they forgave me. It is staggering to realize how I lived like an orphan, whereas, in reality, I was not an absolute orphan. My mother was still alive out there, out and about minding her own business. What was even more confusing was the fact that she was still around and was in the same town I was in all along. She just made sure that our paths never crossed. My mother had 3 children, but she lived as though she had none. I'm unable to understand that, but it is what it is, and what's done is done. If it wasn't for Mrs. Petersons and Mr. Petersons, I don't know where I would have been and what I would have become. I would have not met the people that came across my way. Even though life with Mrs. Petersons and Mr. Petersons had improved a lot, I'd say that I still had to work harder than any child. Though I never complained, but to some extent I was being helped, and I also had to play my part. I had to do whatever work that was assigned to me. It was during the same year that I received tragic news, but not so tragic news. I had just come back from school, and I noticed that on that day, something was different about Mrs. Petersons. She was down. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know where to begin. I changed into my home clothes and then washed my school shirt as I always did and quickly grabbed something to eat. It was just after I had finished eating when Mr. Petersons called me in. I quickly came in and perched myself on the old, worn-out couch that was in the corner of the living room. I do not know how to say this, but today we received the news that your mother has passed away, he said. Hearing that, I couldn't understand why it was so hard for them to say it, but part of me understands now. I didn't know how to feel about that news. In fact, to me that made no sense to me at all, nor did it change how I felt. All I knew was that I was not sad at all. I was just numb. That is it, numb. But does that mean I was happy? Of course not. I just couldn't relate. My mother was like a stranger to me. I didn't hate her, nor was I angry. The news about her passing away wasn't as tragic to me as it should have been. The following day I woke up and went to school like any normal day. The only thing I knew was the fact that now I was an orphan indeed, and even that was not a big deal to me. I had embraced that from the day that my mother walked out of our lives at the tender age. All those years that we suffered while she was still alive. 2 weeks passed, and my mother was buried. For whatever reason, I couldn't make it to the funeral, and it still felt normal. I was 13 years old. The tragic news was the passing away of Mrs. Petersons a year later. I was doing the 6th grade. If I remember correctly, her passing away was so tragic for me. As a result, a lot of things were on my mind, and one of those things was I worried about my stay and my future. I had been staying there in the first place because of Mrs. Petersons. She was the one I was related to, and if it wasn't for her, I don't think they would have allowed me to stay there, and I would have not even dared to run to that house that night. Weeks and months went by, things were slowly returning to normal again, and the hard work increased. I remember I used to be up and down from morning till the evening. The only time I had to rest was when I was at school or when I had to go to bed. Mrs. Petersons had a daughter, and she lived with us and her 2 children. Not that she didn't like me, but I could sense that she just didn't care. I could tell from the nasty comments she would make sometimes. She never liked the idea of me resting or playing with the other children, and this is how I knew, on a day-to-day basis, she used to assign a lot of housework for me almost every day. It was mostly dishes and cleaning the house and making sure that her children's shoes were polished and their school uniform was washed and ironed. Whenever she was around, I knew that day I would stand outside the entire day washing the dishes. It was plate after plate, and cup after cup. Her son kept bringing them one after the other. While all that was happening, someone was noticing. He used to come once in a while to check on Mr. and Mrs. Petersons, his parents, and sometimes he would make remarks that I was always busy. There were times he'd ask the people at the house when I got the time to rest. That happened more often when Mrs. Petersons died. Her daughter made me work around the house while her son was watching TV. Even after all that, I never complained. I knew I had to do what I had to do, and I knew that for me to continue staying there, I had to be useful. When is he getting time to rest? Mr. Smith asked. Mr. Smith asked me to visit him at his house, and when I got there, I received a big surprise from him. He had bought me new clothes. That was the first time someone had done that for me in a million years. Blue jeans, a blue sweater, a shirt, and a black pair of shoes, and he also invited me to go to church with him every Sunday. Without hesitation, I agreed. He was a well-respected man, so nobody at the house objected to that. I was also introduced to his family. He and his wife had children. His house was just a few minutes from Mr. and Mrs. Petersons' house. That was the same man who took me in 5 years later when Mrs. Petersons died. It was one of those lazy mornings when I had just woken up, and the first thing that caught my eye was the dishes that were already placed outside, dishes that needed to be washed. I still remember vividly the designated area where I usually washed the dishes. It was on a roughly designed table. The top was made of corrugated iron, and it had 4 crooked wooden legs. That was the table I used to stand next to hours and hours, washing the dishes daily. It was my job to ensure that the dishes on that table were washed and to avoid problems and being scolded. I had to keep checking on that table frequently. What was interesting was that I wasn't the only child at the house, but I knew and understood that we were not in the same situation. I had to work harder than anyone. I had to make myself useful to continue staying there peacefully, and so that was exactly what I did. It was also my job to ensure that the house was spotlessly cleaned and the containers of water were filled up, or else it meant that I was going to be scolded. It was just after 11 a.m. when I had just finished washing the dishes. The sun was intensifying. I had been standing there since morning, washing dish after dish that was coming from the kitchen. Somebody came to me and they needed me to take the message to Mr. Smith's house. That was going to be my break, I thought to myself. I was planning to take my time while going there. That was the only time I could get to rest from long hours of standing and washing the dishes in the blazing sun. I jumped at the opportunity of being sent outside the house, because it offered me a chance to rest. That morning I hadn't had my breakfast yet because I still had a lot to do. I also realized that if I reported to someone that was inside the house that I was being sent somewhere by someone, I'd end up not going. Therefore I decided I was going to just disappear and explain myself later when I had returned. I can't quite recall exactly the details of the message that I was supposed to convey when I got to Mr. Smith's house, but I could get there sooner than I expected. While on the way, I figured that if I get there sooner, I'd be able to buy some time for playing for a while with Mr. Smith's children, and that is exactly what I did. Mr. Smith was a very kind man. I remember that even when I was still staying at my uncle's house, he used to see me going down the road. He always greeted me, and he respected me even though I was a child and insignificant. Sometimes he would stop and ask me questions. He seemed to be concerned about me. When I got to his house that morning, he was working in his yard, and he kindly welcomed me in. The gate was locked, so he quickly went inside to get the key and opened it for me. He already knew me, and wasting no time, I quickly explained to him what had brought me there. He asked me to get inside and rest a bit. He also instructed his 2 children to offer me something to drink as the sun was boiling outside. "Have you eaten, though?" he asked. "No, not yet," I responded. Mr. Smith was so shocked hearing that at that time of the day, I still hadn't had my breakfast. It made him indignant. "They only send you around without giving you food," said Mr. Smith. I remained quiet. He asked me to wait for a while. "I will tell you when you should go," he added. I sat there and played the whole day. It was around 6 p.m. when I learned I wasn't going back. The following day, which was Sunday evening, he told me to fetch my school clothes and whatever I could get and come back to his house, because the following day was going to be Monday and I needed to be at school. That was when I suspected I was going to stay with them, but I wasn't sure for how long. It also meant that I was going to be the 7th child. That was exactly what happened. It seemed like he had already called his younger sister and explained that he was taking me because when I got to the house to fetch my belongings she never said a word and she was fuming, as she didn't want me to leave. Chapter 9. Good people do exist. Things were looking better than before. The past was slowly passing, and the future was approaching. Nobody knew what it held, but it was sure promising. I had no idea when exactly Mr. Smith planned to take me in, and I also don't believe that it was a decision of the moment. It took me a while to believe that it was finally happening. At first I doubted it. I had thought that I was going to stay there for a few days and then be sent back, but that was not the case. Mr. Smith's decision was final. It took me a few months to adjust and slowly fit in, to accept at last that it was real, and that I had been rescued. I was 12 years old and about to turn 13 the following year when Mr. Smith took me in. Mr. Smith became like a father to me and I became a son to him. The year 2005 was so swift, in no time the schools were about to close. On the last day of school, we received our results, and I had passed my 5th grade. My stay with Mr. Smith's family made the difference. I am fully convinced that if I had not met him, I would not be where I am today and I would not have met the people that came my way. I knew and understood that what he wanted was what was best for me. All that was done so that they could help me, and he proved that in so many ways more than once. He made sure that they paid my school fees, and that I had a school uniform, and he also stood up for me when times got tough. There were challenges though that I had to endure. First, I understood I was not the biological child, and that understanding was the very thing that carried me through. It made me never compare myself with the other 6 children at home. I understood I was being helped. It was very kind of them to let me become part of their family. This was the same case as with the other family that I had encountered before. I didn't expect to be treated equally with the other children. This is not to say people are incapable of raising children that aren't their own as their own. I am a product of such. I have met a dozen of very generous people who were kind and loving towards me and who treated me as their own son. Mr. Smith had a wife. She tolerated me. It didn't seem like there was a solid agreement between Mr. and Mrs. Smith about my stay at their house, but Mr. Smith, being the man that he was, made sure that he made it happen. Despite it being hard for Mrs. Smith. A lot of things happened from the year 2006 to the year 2008. Those were things that affected me emotionally, but those things made me mentally tough and laser-focused. Like in all the houses I had been to, I also had to work harder than everyone. I had to do house chores including cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry for everyone every week. If there was anything wrong or that wasn't done properly, I was the one who had to suck it up and bear the responsibilities. Sometimes Mrs. Smith would complain about the food, especially the bread, that it was getting finished so quickly. Sometimes she would make comments in passing about how expensive the food was. And at some point, she would mention that she would take us along when she went for shopping so that we could see how expensive the food was. Such comments made me so afraid to eat when she was around. Sometimes I would wait until she had gone to bed and then I would eat, but even then I still had to be on my guard. Another thing that used to happen was when it would be the time for shopping at the beginning of the year for things like school uniforms, the 6 children would be called and would be taken around the store by Mrs. Smith, so they could choose whatever they needed while I stood there in the middle of the store not knowing what to do. I always knew that I should not follow along because she would call them by name, one by one. There were also a lot of complaints if I had to ask for school essentials, especially like study materials. All these occurrences made me more and more silent. I suffered silently and alone, and it also made me understand my stance and know that Mr. Smith was the only one that truly cared for me in that house. There were several times when I would get the silent treatment for months for unknown reasons from Mrs. Smith, and those were serious silent treatments, because at those times I entirely depended on them. It all started when I was still in primary school and when I was still in high school, and even later on, but then I was already tough-minded, with or without certain people talking to me. It never made much of a difference. I had already accepted. I was being helped, therefore there are other things I had to pretend were not happening. I shared a room with Mr. and Mrs. Smith's youngest son and the age difference was 7 years apart. There were several times when clothing items would be bought for him only and I used to be excluded. That didn't seem to bother me at all. Why? I knew they didn't have to. Another thing that would happen was that the other children did no work around the house. They sat and watched TV the whole day while I was busy working, grinding, making sure that their laundry was done, ironed and food was prepared. That continued for months and years, in fact during my entire stay with Mr. Smith's family. Mr. Smith never liked that, and he always rebuked the other children for sitting down and watching TV while I was choked with house chores. Since they knew that he always complained about the same things when he returned from work, they figured a way to trick him, and they always got away with it. This is what they'd do. When they saw their father's car coming through the gate, they would quickly run to where I was working and pretend to be working with me, and when he had left, they'd run back to the couches and continue watching television or playing TV games. That continued for several years. The only time that I felt free and relaxed was when I was at school, but when the last bell rang, I knew that my stress had begun. Mr. Smith tried, by all means, to make sure that I felt like I was at home. In him, I found a father, but I understood he was a one-man army fighting a million battles. I understood he had to push against all odds so I could find a place like home in his house. To get through those tough times, I knew I needed to focus and do well at school. And so I counted the years silently every time I passed to the next grade, and that was what kept me going. I had done so well at school for my 9th grade and was awarded a bursary for my 10th grade. The bursary required me to move to another city, and it covered costs for food, tuition, uniform, and accommodation, basically everything. The bursary gave me a huge break from everything. It meant that I was going to be home only when schools were closed, and that was exactly what happened. The break I thought I was going to get in 4 to 5 years got to me very early. The 3 years of high school went so quickly, and before I knew it, it was my last year in high school. I was in matric. That was a do or die situation. I had to do everything I could to pass my matric. That was the time I had been waiting for my entire life. The year 2012 was such a short year, it felt like it. The end of the year came, and it was about the time we wrote our final exams. It was not long after that. The schools closed, and we had to say our goodbyes to our friends. It was a sad departure, but we had hoped that we would meet again soon. I had to pack and head back home. 3 years were over, and I had grown and was slowly becoming a fine young man, who had faced many challenges in his childhood that nobody knew anything about. The Christmas holiday came, and then New Year's Eve. It was around the 3rd or 4th of January 2013 when the big news came. I passed my matric exam. That was the beginning of reality. Big decisions had to be made and new lessons needed to be learned. University or look for work? Those were the two big questions that were on my mind. All I knew was that I wanted to further my studies, but the problem was, where was I going to get the money from? That was another mountain to climb. However, I did not let that question stop me. All I knew was that I had to move, and so I started applying. I applied to several universities, but with no luck. One university called me in for an entrance test, but that did not work out well. I failed their test, so I was not accepted. That was the saddest news. Because of desperation and the need to avoid staying at home because I knew it was not good for my mental health, I ended up registering at one of the technical colleges. It was a private college, an extremely expensive college, but the registration was affordable. Mr. Smith came through again. He could help me with the registration amount, but that was all he could do, and I understood. Registering at the technical college also gave birth to other expenses. I had to rent a flat, and I had to eat, and have study materials, and clothing. I could pay for the rent for the first month. I needed just $700 for that because I was sharing the flat with someone. It was during the first 2 weeks of attending college that I realized I would not make it because of finances. There were times I did not have food, and as for clothing, I only had a pair of pants and sandals. I was not wearing a school uniform anymore, so the reality kicked in, and it was dealing with me harshly. I needed clothes to wear and a bunch of other essentials, but there was no way those needs could be met as soon as needed, therefore a quick decision needed to be made. I quickly registered at the college, and they gave me a partial refund which I returned to Mr. Smith. The college only took $500 for the admin fees. I told Mr. Smith that I had registered and was planning to rewrite my other 2 subjects to increase my points. During that time, I also looked for work so I could continue paying for the flat. I could not find a proper job at that time. The only job I could find was that of being a painter. It was a 6-to-6 job, and it was a risky job. We were painting the tall buildings along the coast in Durban. There were times when they would not pay the employees, but we continued showing up, with the hope that maybe next time they'd pay, but still there was no payment. That happened for several fortnights until the day that I had to make another decision, deciding to walk away, deciding that enough was enough. I left that job. The only choice I had was to go back home, because that year was already wasted. The time came when I had to rewrite my 2 subjects. There was not much of a difference, only one level up on one subject, but the other one remained the same. 2 years later that made quite a difference. It was the year 2014 when I headed back to my hometown. I tried again to apply to the university the following year, but I was not accepted anywhere. I had to secure a space at the university for 2 consecutive years with no luck. The following year, 2015 was going to be my 3rd year, sitting at home, but something happened. Something that changed my life. Chapter 10. Turning your struggles into something beautiful. The feeling of stagnation is the feeling that puts a lot of pressure on the mind, especially when you know you should be somewhere in life. It is one of the feelings that give birth to depression. To overcome this feeling, one must find something to do, something to chase each day. Having a purpose in life is vital. It keeps one's mind occupied. It means that even in the midst of challenges, one can still thrive and push through the resistance. It was towards the end of the year 2014 when I felt so much pressure in my life. I was almost at the point of giving up. I felt like I was back to ground zero. The only difference then was the fact that all the pressure, exactly as it was, People's intentions were seen as vivid as they were, which led to a heightened amount of anxiety and stress. At the beginning of that year, I tried to apply to several universities, but I was still not accepted to any of them. I still got the same results as the previous years. The same entrance tests that I never passed came back, and I still failed them all. As long as I was still applying to study at one university in KwaZulu-Natal, I would not study at all, but despite all that, I was still persistent in my approach. During 2014, I worked as a garden boy earning $80 a day, which went to my transport costs going back home, which also meant I only got to keep the change from that. I had tried to place my resume with different shops around Esho, but with no luck. It was around September 2014 when I got a proper job at Esho Boxer Superstore as a cashier. It's amazing how I got that job. It was around 09 midnight when I had just finished dropping my resume in a few stores. I had skipped Boxer Superstar. On my way back home, I dropped the last resume copy at Boxer Superstar. The manager took my resume and had a look at it and then decided that I should come the following day for training. That is how I landed my first job. I did not have clothes that could last me for a week. I had to go to one of my friends to borrow them. He gave me a few t-shirts, and they helped. Sometimes I had to walk 10 kilometers from work because I did not have money for transport. I lived on the outskirts of town. Sometimes it was hard, especially during winter, but I had no other choice. I had to do what I had to do. I worked for Boxer Superstore for 3 months, then I was without a job again. Because of the stress and anxiety that came with being stagnant, and the pressure of being at home. I was the only one at home then. I had just come out of high school, and that came with a lot of responsibilities like cleaning the house, and making sure that the laundry was done and ironed for everyone. That was when I started working out. What I would do was a workout and then do all the tasks that were assigned, and then at 1600 hours I would go for a jog again. Around 10 kilometers 6 days a week. That gave me an enormous sense of freedom. It set my mind free. It was during that time that I could think about all the things I wanted to do. I could set the goals I wanted to achieve. From jogging, I started doing push-ups and other varieties of free weight exercises. After about a month, I noticed changes in my body and my attitude toward life. My confidence grew, and I became stronger and stronger mentally and physically. I learned a new survival mechanism. I turned my struggles into something beautiful, and to free the mind, I had to put my body under stress and pain. Working out became an escape for me, and it changed my life for the better. I started looking at life differently. I approached all the hurdles that I had to push through back then with a new attitude. I viewed it as training, and I also understood that it was there to propel me to the future. It was during that year that a lot of good and amazing people came across my way. Surely if Mr. Smith hadn't come across my way, I wouldn't have met all the amazing people that came across my way after that, and I don't think that I'd be where I am today. It was through Mr. Smith that I became a Christian, which introduced me to a group of God-fearing people. I remember that Mr. Smith would take us to church every Sunday morning, which began when I was still staying at his parents' house. It all started on the day he had just come to check up on his parents, and he left the message that I should come to his house, and that was the day I found out that he had bought me new clothes and told me I should come for a visit with them to the church, of which I gladly did. That was how I came across many other people that went to church with Mr. Smith. Among those people was Mr. White. Mr. White was one of the people that made a huge impact on my life. I had known him for a few years, almost throughout my teenage years. He became like a father to me. I had listened to many of his lessons at church, and he was quite a remarkable man, devoted to doing good work for the Lord. He was all that I wanted to be. Before that, I had been to some of his Bible studies, and I have heard him preach several times. One day I had just come back from dropping my resumes in town. It was around the early afternoon of Saturday, 2014. I was walking down the streets of Esho, and little did I notice that a man was following me behind. He patted me on my shoulder. "Let's go sit down inside that building," he said. When I turned to look who it was Mr. White. He had already identified me, even though I was facing the other way. He was coming from the coffee shop. We immediately entered that building that was on the side of the road. "What are your plans for next year?" Mr. White asked. "I'm planning to further my studies," I replied. "Would you like me to help you financially?" he asked. "Yes. I'd appreciate that a lot," I replied. After that interesting short conversation, Mr. White asked me to walk down with him to his house. We had lunch and he also broke the news to his wife that he was planning to help me with my university studies the following year, and his wife responded with a huge smile on her face. When I got home, I broke the news that Mr. White had volunteered to help me further my studies the following year. It filled me with excitement, and I was hopeful about the future. Although I had tried all those past years to get into the university, I did not know where the funds would come from. I kept sending through the applications and getting rejected. Yet I was still persistent, but that news that came with Mr. White changed my life forever. There was one problem though. I hadn't been accepted into any university. The applications that I had sent to many universities were unsuccessful, and one thing I had told myself was that I would not be stuck at home for the third year and that someone had promised to assist me. I had to fight. I had to do all that was in my power to secure the space at the university because I had good points to qualify. I had worked so hard for the matric exam that I qualified to study for a bachelor's degree. An option that was left for me to explore in pursuit of securing a space at the university was to go to the universities directly, faculty by faculty, and ask for a space. However, that method has a very low success rate. Somebody I knew whom I went to primary school with made it first to the university before I did. He had promised that if I came to his campus, he would help me secure space, because he knew the relevant people, and so that was the first place I thought of going. But to my surprise, when I got there, my ex-schoolmate gave me so many runs around. He pretended. He appeared to be so busy at first. I waited. I later realized that he was too occupied to help. The best he could do was to tell me to go to a neighboring college. I had to accept reality and deal with it. A quick decision needed to be made. Right away, I left Durban because I did not have a place to spend a night. I went back to my hometown. I remembered there was one university to which I had not gone, but even that was purposeful. I did not want to be closer to home, and that's why I left that university. Because of desperation, I went there to enroll so that I do not lose the opportunity to be financed. I did not have money for transport, but fortunately, a brother from church was going to go that route and he was willing to drop me by the university. He knew someone who was studying at the same university and had requested that she help me find my way around. We went to the same church, but in different locations. We might have met several times, but no conversation was shared. She helped me a lot in finding my way around the campus, but there were also so many people in my situation doing walk-ins. I had to stand in a long, hopeless queue. The time was running out, so they quickly took our names down and we were told to come back the following day, which I did, but the results were the same. The following day was going to be Friday, which meant that if things didn't go as planned I would have to decide whether I come back the following week or go try somewhere else. The day had just ended, and it was clear that I wouldn't get any space that week. The day had just ended, and it was clear that I wouldn't get any space that week. There were too many prospective students also hunting for spaces. When I was about to exit the university, I received a call from home, letting me know our neighbor has a child that studies at the University of the Free State, which was 5 hours and 18 minutes from my hometown. The message also continued that my neighbor was going there on Monday to register her child who was a returning student, and there seemed to be spaces available. I jumped at the opportunity. It was already late for me to make it back home, but what I did was ask one of my friends who was living not very far from the university to accommodate me for the night. The plan was to wake up in the morning and head straight home. He agreed, and he came to fetch me at the university. Early in the morning, I had to hitchhike back home. It took me 40 minutes to get home. By 7 a.m. I was back in my hometown. The first thing I did was go to Mr. White's house and update him about the possibility of me securing the space at the University of the Free State. It was still early in the morning, but luckily, Mr. White was already up. He had just finished having his coffee when I had just popped in and broke the news. He was excited to hear the news and for that trip. He offered me $3,000 to cover my traveling expenses. That was a lot of money in 2014. I used a little of it because he also offered to drive me to the nearest city where I was going to spend a night at my neighbor's house. And early in the morning, we were going to take a trip to the Free State province. We left in the early morning hours for the Free State, and by 11:30 a.m. we arrived. It was my first time traveling such a long distance and leaving my province. When we got there, I found out that it was not the same as in KZN. There were no queues, and everything was straightforward. They showed me where to go first. Even though the application form was free, I had to fill it in and submit, and then my points were counted. I was qualifying to be in the mainstream. I handed in my completed form, and my results, and that was it. I was told to go home and wait for an SMS. Once I received the SMS, I needed to come back for registration. It was on a Friday, and because I was skeptical if I would get a space, I had to wait at home. On the same day, I had to hitchhike back to KZN, and the easiest route for that was to go via Durban, and I could make it back on time to Durban. The rest was a waiting game. Part of me still did not believe that things could be that simple. Before going to the Free State province, I had to face many rejections, and that was the reason for my skepticism. The weekend came and passed, Monday came, and I kept checking on my phone every passing second. The day ended and Tuesday came and there was still no response. However, on Wednesday afternoon the SMS popped and that was it. I was in. I screamed and jumped, and that was the turning point of my life. Chapter 11. Learning from the struggles. What drives you? What pushes you to do whatever it takes to succeed and be all that you ever wanted to be? I am sure that by now you are aware of all the tough situations that I have been through in my life while growing up. Maybe part of the questions you are asking yourself is, what was my drive and motivation to persist, to press on, and to keep going? Not that there were no times when I felt like giving up. There were plenty of those times, if I must tell you. I had two choices. I used all the hate that was directed at me, all the unkindness, and all the unfairness as my strength. I allowed all that to propel me to greater heights. I realized the situation I was in, and I understood how difficult it was, but I also had to realize that there was also some good in it. God has been the pillar of my strength. I believe He is the giver of all the good things that I have. It was difficult to see and keep that in my mind while I was still a young boy, but at this point in my life, I have grown and know more about God. I see He is indeed the provider of the fatherless. The Bible, which I believe is the true word of God, does state this so many times. Over and over in the Bible, we see and hear that God is listening to the prayers of those who are helpless. I believe God saw my situation, and He provided me with everything that I needed. I believe and I embrace that fact wholeheartedly, and, because of that understanding, I could turn my struggles into strengths and my pain into gain. Hunger was also one thing that pushed me to do my best, to go the extra mile, and to do what I was supposed to do, because I was hungry both figuratively and literally. It had been 2 full years of rejection from the universities before I could finally get accepted at the University of the Free State. The year 2015 was going to be the 3rd year of staying at home. To stay hungry and keep pursuing my aspirations, I had to keep those thoughts at the forefront of my head throughout my studies. The thoughts of hard times motivated me to do my best. I was hungrier than ever before. I knew what I wanted, and I was going to do whatever it takes to get there because I had already known what being stuck felt like. I also understood that was the only chance I could ever get, and so I had to make it count. There was no way I was going to fail any module because Mr. White had told me that if I failed any of the modules, he would not continue paying for me. Although he said that jokingly, I took it seriously, and that became my motivation to continue working hard. The duration of my degree was 3 years. I could do that in record time, and by 2017 my BA qualification was in. The man I had to make sure he was there on my graduation day was Mr. White and Mr. Smith, for they had played a huge part in my success, and celebrated that day together. I could imagine how it must have felt like seeing me walking across the graduation stage, knowing very well that he had played a huge part to make that happen. He had been with me from the first day of university until the end. He made sure that I had something to wear and eat, and that my tuition fees and accommodation were fully paid. All I had to do was focus on studying. When the year 2017 ended, I opted to further my studies. In the year 2017, I received a bursary, but those funds had to be returned to the funders because my tuition fees and accommodation were all ready. However, I could take advantage of those funds the following year. Before the end of 2017, I had secured a job at the computer lab on the university campus. I then informed Mr. White about my plans for the following year, and I let him know how thankful I was for the help that he had given me, and that he did not have to worry about the following year, because I had received a bursary and I had also received a contract from the university's computer lab. Besides that, I had been nominated to become the chairperson of Student Representative Sports Affairs, which also paid me a stipend. Mr. White was so happy for me, and he continued to keep in touch throughout the year 2018. Come to think of it, I am where I am today because of Mr. White. If our paths had not met, I doubt that I would have gone through university. His love and kindness pushed me to push through the challenges. He said not only that he loves me, but he went as far as proving it. He changed my world and has taught me to change the world of others I might come across one day. In my life, I had the privilege to meet many good people who have helped me regardless of how big or small the help they gave me. It has contributed to the man that I am today, and I truly appreciate it. Growing up the way I did has taught me many lessons that I still apply even now. One of these lessons is the fact that hard times are temporary and that things get worse before they get better. Therefore, if you persist long enough, your sunny days are surely on their way. When going through hard times, it is always best to not think about what is happening, but fix your gaze on the future. Look beyond your current circumstance and envision how beautiful the future would look. You need to stay with it throughout the entire process. Another lesson I learned was to realize the position I'm in and accept reality as it was. Let us say, for example, you are a kid who is in my situation right now. You do not have parents. Whether they have died or have abandoned you, it makes no difference. Let's say someone comes along and feels sorry for you such that they decide to take you in, assuming that they also have their children to take care of. That means extra responsibility for these two people. Your responsibility in this circumstance is to understand that you are being helped and that chances for you to become a priority will always be slim or zero. So, therefore, accept that reality and have no expectations. If you are not being prioritized, do not get mad, and do not compare yourself with the other children. Appreciate every little kindness that you might receive from this person who has taken you in. Know and understand that if there is anything you need, it is your responsibility to go work hard for it when the time allows. Therefore, learn to be understanding and never compare yourself with anyone. Understand that you are being helped, but keep working towards your goals. Another beautiful thing that I discovered amid my struggles was the fact that school was my only friend. Showing up at school and committing myself to it was the only thing that was going to set me free from my struggles. First, I would like to submit that my struggles at home were the ones that pushed me to school in the first place, and second, the school was the only place in which I felt so free. And when that bell went off, I knew that playtime was over. All that caused me to love being. But it was not just only that. I think the understanding of what school was going to do for me at a later stage helped me a lot. I committed to every single task that was assigned to me by my teachers. It is crucial that I also state that this kind of attitude does not have to begin at a certain level or grade, but it should begin as early as possible, as early as primary school. School is the only way that is going to save you if you are stuck in a similar situation. It will ensure that you do not suffer twice. You will not suffer as a child and also as an adult. I strongly believe that I am where I am because of the small decisions that I have also made. No matter how trivial some may perceive those decisions, they contributed to my current destination. I might have not been the best performer in high school, but I sure worked hard and I was responsible. I always made sure that I knew what I needed to know. I played my part and made sure that my work was done to the best of my ability, and that was how I progressed from one grade to another. Another important aspect of suffering and being oppressed is that you decide how much you want the suffering to control you. One could be amidst suffering and still be at peace. You ask yourself why that is. And how does one achieve this level? The answer to this is pretty simple. It is all about mindset, and that is the part that you always have control over. Focusing your mind on the after means that you are always looking for ways in which you can use your struggles to work for you, not against you. I have to say this, you will always have people trying to derail you, trying and discourage you. However, you still have control over how much of that will affect you. Your responsibility is to ensure that you stand up for yourself. That does not mean that you have to always not do what you are told or be rebellious, but it means to figure out how you are going to maneuver around the situation. There are many forms in which people could try to derail you or prevent you from achieving your goals, and make sure that you stay behind. That is why you need to be open-minded and read every situation, making sure that you assess the intention in every encounter. People that try to work against you or make sure that you fail are already aware of what is crucial to you and your future, and surely the obvious thing they will always try to control is your future. To further clarify this, let me make an example. The family I once stayed with while I was growing up. One of the family members would always make sure that I had a lot of house chores throughout the day, and there was no break time in between in the evening. She would make sure that we sleep at a certain time. I had to make sure that I studied during the night when everyone was sleeping because I understood that school was the only thing that would take me out of my struggles. If you are someone right now going through the same struggles, know things will not stay the same forever, and how your situation changes entirely depends on how you handle it. Taking care of the small stuff that needs to be handled, making sure that your education is a priority is one of the important things that you should always think about. There was a time in my early primary school years when I had just moved in with another family. They allowed me to stay there, and they did not have to because I was not their child, but they did. However, in return I had to work harder, making sure that the house was cleaned, including the yard. I also had to fetch water from the river every day, and there were times I had to make sure that their laundry was done. They did have children that were about my age, but it seemed like my arrival immediately sent them on a holiday. Although every chore in the house has to be done by me alone while other children were playing outside, I never felt the need to complain about any of that because my education was being prioritized. They allowed me to go to school, and that was more than what I could ever ask for, and I was more than willing to break my back for that. Even though I did not have a school uniform and had to differ from other children at school, I still did not feel the need to grumble. I had my priorities straight, and I could look at the bigger picture. This point aims to show you that things are not entirely out of your control. There is always that significant amount that you have control over. You have control over how your story will end. You hold the pen and you are the author of your story, and your story is your life. Most of the time, we feel like our situation is out of our control and there is nothing we can do about it because the other person has total control over us and we depend on them. This is not true. The moment you think like this is when you lose the battle. In every situation, no matter how worse it is, there is always something you can do, there is always a way out, and it is your responsibility to find that way out. Think about how you can make your situation work for you, not against you. Chapter 12. Seeing the beauty in each and every situation. In every challenging circumstance, there is always something beautiful. Challenges make us who we are, they mold us into all the beautiful shapes. It is through challenges that our mindset is toughened and our survival muscles are developed. And because of this, it is of paramount importance to train your mind to see the beauty of each and every situation. I am who I am because of what I have been through. If circumstances I have been through weren't challenging, I don't think I'd be where I am today, and I don't think I would have made the decisions that I've made. As I'm in the adulthood phase, the reason I can endure whatever struggles life throws at me is because of all the dark corners I have been pushed to. They have enabled me to develop most of my resilience muscles. Another important aspect I have discovered is the fact that there is always a lifelong lesson that you can always gain from every challenging situation. Whether the lessons are painful or sweet, they are still lessons, and whether they put you in certain situations intending to harm you or hinder you to make it in life, there is always a lesson that you can take out from whatever circumstance. Therefore, you must always look out for the lesson in whatever circumstance you might find yourself in. Of course, there are thousands of lessons that I learned from my dreadful childhood experiences, and most of those lessons have shaped me into the human being that I am today. One of these main lifelong lessons I had to learn in my childhood was not to grumble, to do whatever had to be done, and to get over it. Let me break it down for you, in case you are wondering why this is even important to mention as the lesson. When I was still a child, I lived with different people, and in some of these families, I had to work extra hard so I could stay there. There was always work to do, and as much as I was not the only child in those families, I had to do most of the work alone while other children were playing outside or watching TV. From what I have heard or observed, people will complain about the silliest things such as these. From this scenario, I learned that observing, remaining quiet, doing whatever has to be done, and moving on, don't hurt at all, and to tell you, I still apply this on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't mean that I let people walk all over me or mistreat me. It doesn't mean that I don't question things. I question things and I stand up for myself when the need arises. But I don't entertain petty businesses. Growing up without parents was a blessing in disguise for me. It came with many blessings and many lessons. Moving from house to house, and living with different people, taught me a lot about a lot of things and different people. Unfortunately in life, we meet people who will want to make our lives miserable for whatever reasons, and sometimes hate, resentment, and jealousy always motivate those reasons. You have got to learn to maneuver around those without being petty. The sad reality is, victims become victimizers. Most people who grew up in a toxic environment like mine, grow up and become toxic people and make everybody's life miserable. In most cases, you find that people who mistreat other people have been mistreated in the past as well, but does that give them a right to make other people's lives miserable? Absolutely not. In life, we always have a choice to be better than our victimizers. People who choose to become victimizers have no excuse and should at all costs be held accountable for their actions. The past makes us who we are, but it never controls us. Deep down, we all know this and we can't deny it. Again, we always have a choice to be better than our victimizers, to be better than those who mistreated us or looked down upon us. Are you going through the same situation right now? Or have you been through the same situation as me? Are you full of anger and hatred? And want to take revenge for all that was done to you? It is natural to feel like that, but you don't have to feel like that anymore. You are way stronger than you think and have made it out alive. Time flies and you keep moving, keep setting those goals, crush them one by one, celebrate silently, and keep counting the years. It works. It worked for me too. If you feel like today is worse than yesterday, remember that it always gets worse before it gets better. Find a quiet place, go back to those times or think about all that you went through or going through, realize that there is some good in it, and take only the lessons. All that was meant to make you tough and stronger than before. Suffocate all the hate and revengeful thoughts out of your system, because these two things, hate and revengeful thoughts, spread like wildfire and they destroy you internally, and before you know it, you are dead alive. To tell you the truth, your victimizers, if they still have a functional conscience, have it worse than you. They see you now and realize how far you have come. They remember everything they did to you. They remember vividly that they once tried to break you, destroy you and stand in your way. There is no rest for them. Sometimes they may fall into a delusion that you were still too young and you do not remember all those horrible things they did to you. However, you still remember everything like it happened yesterday. They forget a person can forget stories they've been told or read about, but they may never forget about things that are life's experiences. The past makes us who we are, but we still get to choose whether we let it work for us or against us. I'm a living example of that, and many others who have been through situations like mine but choose to never let their past destroy them. Therefore, things are not entirely out of your control. There is a significant amount of things that you have control over. Yes. You can't control who your parents are, whether they become bad parents, and whether they abandon you, but you can choose to be a humble child or person that obeys those who are trying to help you out of your situation. You can choose to respect and follow the instructions of those who have taken you in and whose roof you live under. You can choose to be a good child or a good person even at school, and respect your teachers so that you can get good grades. This is where the trick is. And that is how you can turn your situation from bad to good, and you can significantly have control over your future. Things are not entirely out of your control. You have control over your destiny. You are the one who shapes your future. The decisions that you are taking will determine where you end up in life. If you have been following my story up to this point, you might wonder where I am in life, and how far I have come. It has indeed been a long journey, but the journey still goes on. It has not ended. I do not have hate in my heart toward those who have mistreated me. I do not have regrets. And besides, I am not the one, or you are not the one who should have regrets. They are the ones who did those things to me or you. How they treated me or you was entirely out of your control or my control. They were horrible toward me or you. So why should I be the one feeling the guilt? Holding grudges will only destroy oneself, so I have got none. Suffocate all the hatred and anxiety. Walk with your head held high, because you are a survivor. Overcoming one challenge leads to other challenges, and every time one overcomes a certain challenge, it prepares one for the upcoming challenges. This is exactly what has also happened to me. Overcoming all those challenges in my early childhood has prepared me for life. I am malleable. I am both strong. I am compassionate, and I am kind because people have been unkind to me. I can love because I know what being unloved feels like. There is no reason for me to feel like I need to change direction when I am about to meet or come across people who have put me through the worst before. I look them in the eye. I say thank you very much. One of the most shocking things is the fact that some people corrupt their conscience. Either they have corrupted their conscience or they become delusional. As the true saying goes, there is no rest for those who mistreat others. I hope they heal and find peace. But then again, if you go around mistreating other people, you cannot be normal, because that is not normal human nature. God made us so that we love and care for others. People who still choose to be hostile towards others might pretend like it does not bother them anymore, but deep down it does. We should take only the lessons. Whatever that you do to make sure that you do not become exactly like the person who mistreated you, and when it is in your power, teach that person what it is like to be a better person. Be a bigger man or woman, choose kindness, choose love, choose compassion. You will make it in life, and you will go far, but when you get there, be kinder than before towards those who have mistreated you. They will learn. Another brutal lesson that I have learned about life and people is the fact that some people will rather risk dying with regrets and many questions than say, I am sorry. I shouldn't have done that to you. I made a terrible mistake. Unfortunately, people are so afraid to own up to their shortfalls. Most of it is just ego and the fear of digging back into the past. So you have to suck it up. I have been through these circumstances. If you have gone through the previous chapters already, you would know how my uncle's wife treated me when I was just 6 years old. 22 years later, I had time to meet all those people. The difference then was that I was older and in a far better position. I was not bitter at all. I used to visit when I remembered. However, I still wondered what happened in the corners of her mind when she was alone after I had left. I know that all those things they have done to me would never let them be normal again. I was always ready to forgive her. I had visited her several times before she died. It was sad when I heard of her sudden death one morning. Although I had forgiven her a long time ago and often felt sorry for her, I think it would have made things easier for her, only if she had talked about it. It must have been hard to live with that regret. Situations like these are extremely hard, especially if you are a victim. The victimism might completely misunderstand you and also feel threatened by you when you try to start the conversation about how they have mistreated you in the past. They might think you are holding grudges and you are there to cause trouble, even when you are only just trying to take care of the problem. But then again, this is only based on assumption, and it is just my opinion. You may never know. Maybe they might take it like they should and apologize and also thank you for initiating the conversation. They might want to bring it up, but they are too ashamed of what they did. The best is to wait for them on hope that it will bother them so badly that they ignore the fear and apologize for what they did. I have seen people die with regrets and fears, the fear of admitting that they were wrong, and the regrets of wishing they never mistreated the other person. The best thing you can do is always leaving the door open, and always be ready to forgive. And it will give you peace and joy in your life.